Hello and welcome to Let's Read True Crime. Before we relax to tonight's stories, please comment where you are watching in the world. Drop a like and subscribe to our channel. Thank you. Now relax and get ready to dig into some true crime cases. Story 1. Detective Tom Jensen sat across from the man he had been hunting for decades, the man whose name had haunted police reports, crime scene files, and the nightmares of countless families. Gary Leon Ridgway, the Green River Killer, sat in the steel chair with a calmness that felt almost obscene. His hands, cuffed in front of him, rested on the table. Ridgway wasn't what people expected him to be. He wasn't a towering, menacing figure with wild eyes and a snarl. Instead, he looked ordinary, unremarkable, forgettable even. A slight, middle-aged man with thinning hair and a soft voice. It was hard to believe that this mild-mannered individual had been the monster who had terrorized the Pacific Northwest for nearly 20 years, responsible for the deaths of at least 49 women, though investigators feared the true number was far higher. The room was thick with tension. Jensen leaned forward, his voice steady but sharp. "Gary, you lied to us for years. You told us you didn't kill those women, but the DNA doesn't lie. We know it's you." Ridgway blinked slowly, his lips pressing into a thin line. He didn't deny it. He didn't argue. Instead, he nodded almost imperceptibly, his face devoid of emotion. "Yeah," he said after a long pause. "I killed them." Jensen felt a chill run down his spine. He had been chasing this man since the early 1980s, following a trail of bodies dumped along the Green River, in wooded ravines, and in forgotten corners of the region. For decades, Ridgway had eluded justice, blending into society as a family man, a churchgoer, and a reliable employee. Now here he was, confessing with the same tone one might use to admit stealing a cookie from the jar. "What made you do it?" Jensen asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Ridgway shrugged as if the question didn't deserve much thought. "I just wanted to kill them," he said flatly. It was easy. The simplicity of his words made them all the more horrifying. There was no remorse, no justification, no attempt to blame anyone or anything else. It was just who he was. The Green River Killer had finally been caught, but the full scope of his evil was only beginning to emerge. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah. He was the middle child in a family of 3 boys, raised by Thomas Ridgway, a bus driver, and Mary Ridgway, a homemaker. Despite the outward appearance of a working-class family, the Ridgway household was far from nurturing. Behind the closed doors of their modest home, the seeds of Gary's later monstrosity were being sown. The family relocated to the Seattle area when Gary was still young, settling in a neighborhood near SeaTac Airport. It was an industrial area, its streets lined with modest houses and the constant roar of airplanes overhead. To outsiders, the Ridgways were unremarkable, blending into the blue-collar fabric of the community. But inside their home, the dynamics were toxic. Mary Ridgway was a domineering and controlling figure, known for her sharp tongue and temper. She ruled the household with an iron fist, directing much of her anger at her sons, especially Gary. Her punishments were often humiliating, and she had an unsettling habit of belittling her boys in ways that struck at their core. Gary, in particular, bore the brunt of her wrath. He would later describe her as both tyrannical and inappropriate, a paradoxical mix of maternal control and sexual discomfort. One of the most disturbing aspects of his childhood was Mary's involvement in Gary's personal hygiene. Even as he grew into adolescence, she continued to bathe him, a practice that blurred boundaries and left him feeling both aroused and ashamed. This confusion around sex and shame would follow him for the rest of his life, warping his perception of women and intimacy. Gary's struggles extended beyond his home life. At school, he was labeled slow and placed in special education classes. His IQ, measured at 82, placed him in the below-average range, and he struggled to keep up with his peers academically. Socially, he was awkward and withdrawn, often the target of bullying. Yet even as a child, he began showing signs of the darkness that lurked within him. One chilling incident occurred when Gary was just 16 years old. He lured a 6-year-old boy into the woods and stabbed him in the ribs. The boy survived and later recounted how Gary had walked away laughing, saying, "I always wondered what it would feel like to kill someone." The attack was dismissed as the impulsive act of a troubled teenager, but it was an ominous precursor to the horrors that would come. After barely graduating high school, Gary enlisted in the U.S. Navy in 1969. He was sent to Vietnam, where he served as a supply clerk. During his time overseas, he began frequenting prostitutes, a behavior that would become a lifelong obsession. Ridgway later claimed that he contracted sexually transmitted infections multiple times during this period, further fueling his growing resentment toward women. When Ridgway returned to Seattle in the early 1970s, he married his high school sweetheart, Claudia Craig. The marriage was short-lived, ending in divorce in 1972. Ridgway blamed Claudia for the failure of their relationship, a pattern he would repeat with his subsequent wives. Beneath his mild-mannered exterior, his hatred for women was festering, and it would soon erupt in violence. The Green River flowed quietly through the Kent Valley in Washington state, its waters dark and still, weaving through a landscape of dense woods and rural patches. It was the kind of place where the wind seemed to carry secrets, a fitting backdrop for the horror that would come to define the area. No one could have known that, in the summer of 1982, the river would become synonymous with death, a final resting place for the young women who disappeared into the night, never to return. The first body was discovered on July 15, 1982. 16-year-old Wendy Lee Caulfield, a runaway from a troubled home, was found floating face down in the murky waters of the Green River. Her body, bloated from days in the water, was caught on a snag near the Peck Bridge. She had been strangled with her own pants, which were still tied tightly around her neck. Wendy's life had been one of struggle and instability. She had grown up in foster homes, bouncing from one place to another until she finally ran away. Like many of the Green River Killer's victims, Wendy worked as a prostitute to survive, plying her trade along Highway 99, a stretch of road infamous for its seedy motels and transient population. Vulnerable and desperate, she had no way of knowing that the man who offered her a ride would also be the one to take her life. Less than a week later, on July 20th, 1982, two more bodies were discovered. Deborah Bonner, 23, and Marcia Chapman, 31, were found in the Green River near a popular swimming hole. Both women had been strangled with ligatures, their bodies dumped in the same cold, in different waters. Investigators noted the eerie similarities. All three victims were sex workers, all had been strangled, and all had been discarded in the same stretch of the river. Deborah Bonner was a petite woman with a sharp wit and a love of music. She had struggled with addiction and turned to sex work to fund her habit, a choice that made her an easy target for predators. Marcia Chapman, a single mother of three, had fallen into prostitution after her marriage fell apart. She had fought hard to provide for her children, but her circumstances left her vulnerable. Her oldest daughter later recalled waiting for her mother to come home that night, only to be greeted by silence that stretched on forever. On August 15, 1982, the body of Cynthia Hines, 17, was discovered in the same area. She had been strangled with her shirt and dumped like trash. Cynthia, known as Cindy to her friends, was a bright and caring teenager who had fallen into prostitution after running away from an abusive home. She was last seen walking along Pacific Highway South, her small frame dwarfed by passing cars. Her disappearance went unnoticed for days, a tragically common theme among the Green River Killer's victims. The body of Opal Mills, 16, was found downstream the same day. Unlike the others, Opal's body had been left partially clothed, her face and body clean, as if the killer had taken extra care with her. Opal was a high school student with dreams of becoming an artist. She was walking home when she was lured into Gary Ridgway's truck. Her family, devastated by her loss, would later describe her as a gentle soul, whose life was stolen far too soon. The discovery of Opal and Cynthia marked a grim escalation. 5 victims in less than a month. The pattern was clear. There was a killer on the loose in the Pacific Northwest, and he was targeting the most vulnerable women in society: prostitutes, runaways, and women struggling to survive at the margins of life. As the summer of 1982 turned into fall, the body count began to rise. By the end of the year, at least 13 women had been found, all with the same haunting similarities. Sex workers or runaways, all strangled, all discarded in wooded areas, ravines, or near the Green River. Some were found nude, others partially clothed, their bodies left in degrading poses that spoke to the killer's deep-seated hatred for women. One by one, their names were added to the growing list. Giselle and Levorn, 17, disappeared in July 1982. Her body was found in September, dumped in a wooded area off Star Lake Road. Denise Bush, 23, vanished in October 1982. Her remains would not be identified until years later. Shirley Sherrill, 18, was last seen in May 1983. Her body was discovered in a remote location, her identity confirmed by dental records. Each victim had a story, a life that was more than the circumstances of their death. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, friends. Their families were left to grapple with a devastating loss, their grief compounded by the knowledge that their loved ones had been preyed upon by a remorseless killer. The King County Sheriff's Office launched one of the most extensive investigations in its history. The Green River Task Force, led by Detective Dave Reichert, worked tirelessly to track down the killer. The task force grew to include dozens of detectives, forensic experts, and eventually criminal profilers from the FBI. They combed through crime scenes, interviewed witnesses, and examined every lead, but the investigation was fraught with challenges. One of the key hurdles was the nature of the victims. Many were sex workers or runaways, women who lived on the fringes of society. Their disappearances often went unnoticed for days or weeks, and by the time their bodies were discovered, crucial evidence had often been degraded by time and the elements. Detectives painstakingly reconstructed the last known movements of each victim, piecing together a chilling pattern. Witnesses reported seeing the women getting into a pickup truck with a soft-spoken man who seemed polite and harmless. One woman, who managed to escape, described the man as middle-aged, with thinning hair and a calm demeanor. Despite these accounts, the killer remained elusive. The task force also faced criticism from the public and the media. Families of the victims accused the police of dragging their feet, while community leaders demanded results. The pressure weighed heavily on Detective Reichert and his team, but they were determined to bring the killer to justice. The Green River Killer was meticulous in his methods, but he wasn't perfect. Over the years, investigators collected key pieces of evidence that would eventually tie Gary Ridgway to the murders. Ligatures. Many victims had been strangled with their own clothing, such as pants or bras. The knots used in these ligatures were studied extensively, revealing a consistent pattern that pointed to a single perpetrator. Dump sites. The killer often returned to the same locations to dispose of multiple bodies, a behavior that provided investigators with valuable geographical data. The Green River, wooded areas near SeaTac, and isolated ravines became the primary focus of the search. Witness accounts. Several women working along Pacific Highway South reported encounters with a man driving a pickup truck. They described him as polite, soft-spoken, and seemingly harmless, a profile that matched Gary Ridgway perfectly. Forensic evidence. Although DNA technology was still in its infancy during the early stages of the investigation, detectives collected biological samples from several victims. These samples would later become the key to solving the case. Detective Reichert's determination. Detective Dave Reichert, who had been with the King County Sheriff's Office for years, became the face of the Green River investigation. He attended autopsies, visited crime scenes, and personally interviewed witnesses. Reichert later said, "The faces of those women haunted me. I couldn't stop thinking about their families, about the lives that were stolen. I promised myself I wouldn't rest until we caught him." But the killer was careful. He knew how to blend in, how to appear ordinary and unremarkable. He was a father, a husband, a churchgoer, and a reliable employee. No one suspected that Gary Ridgway, the quiet man who painted trucks for a living, was also the monster responsible for so much death. By the end of 1983, the task force had identified nearly 24 victims, but they were no closer to making an arrest. The Green River Killer seemed to vanish as quickly as he appeared, leaving behind only devastation and unanswered questions. By late 1983, the Green River Task Force had grown to include dozens of detectives, forensic experts, and criminal profilers. The growing list of victims, each one a young woman brutally killed and discarded like trash, fueled their determination, but it also underscored the monumental challenges they faced. The killer was methodical, careful, and had an uncanny ability to blend into the background of ordinary life. He was a ghost, leaving detectives with little more than bodies and questions. The Pacific Northwest was gripped with fear. The victims were predominantly sex workers or runaways, women who frequented Pacific Highway South, known then as a hub for prostitution. This made them especially vulnerable, as their lifestyle often kept them out of sight, beyond the reach of family and friends who might otherwise sound the alarm. Gary Ridgway knew this. He was a predator who understood his prey, carefully selecting women he believed no one would miss, women who, in his twisted mind, didn't matter. Detective Dave Reichert, who had been among the first to discover the bodies in the Green River, took the case personally. He would later recall how the faces of the victims haunted him, particularly those of the youngest girls, some of whom were barely out of childhood. Reichert attended every autopsy, meticulously reviewed evidence, and walked the dump sites himself, searching for any clue that might lead to the killer. But the investigation faced immense hurdles. The bodies were often left in secluded, wooded areas or near the Green River, exposed to the elements. By the time they were discovered, decomposition had often erased key forensic evidence. And while detectives interviewed hundreds of witnesses, the descriptions of the suspect were vague. He was an average-looking, middle-aged white man driving a truck. It could have been anyone. The killer's ability to evade capture was infuriating. "We felt like we were always one step behind him," Reichert later said. "Every time we got close to a lead, he slipped away." While the task force scrambled to catch up, Gary Ridgway continued to kill. His victims were women with names, stories, and lives that were tragically cut short. Mary Bridget Meehan, 18, disappeared in September 1982. Mary was 4 months pregnant at the time of her death, a detail that deeply disturbed investigators when her body was found months later in a wooded area. Her mother later described her as a spirited, kind-hearted girl who had fallen into difficult times but was trying to turn her life around. Deborah Estes, 15, vanished in September 1982. She was found years later, her skeletal remains uncovered in a ravine. Deborah had been a high school sophomore who loved animals and dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. Her youth and vulnerability made her an easy target for Ridgway. Kimmy Kai Pitzer, 16, disappeared in April 1983. She was last seen getting into a pickup truck along Pacific Highway South, just blocks from where she lived. Her body was found months later in a dense forest. Kimmy's family remembered her as a sweet, shy girl who had struggled to find her place in the world. Ridgway's victims were often found naked or partially clothed, their bodies posed in ways that suggested he took pleasure in degrading them even after death. Investigators noted that many of the women had been strangled with their own clothing or a ligature, a method that required intimate, hands-on contact. This, combined with the lack of other signs of violence, suggested that Ridgway relied on his ability to manipulate and overpower his victims, rather than brute force. The discovery of multiple bodies in the same locations revealed another chilling pattern. Ridgway often returned to his dump sites, revisiting the places where he had left his victims. In some cases, he admitted to engaging in necrophilia with the decomposing remains. Forensic experts later noted that this behavior was not uncommon among serial killers, as it allowed them to relive the thrill of the kill and maintain a sense of control over their victims, even in death. In 1984, the Green River Task Force made a controversial move. They enlisted the help of Ted Bundy, the notorious serial killer who had been captured just a few years earlier. Bundy, who was awaiting execution in Florida, offered to provide insights into the mind of a killer in exchange for certain privileges. While his involvement generated significant media attention, it ultimately led nowhere. Bundy's advice was vague and self-serving, offering little that the task force didn't already know. Meanwhile, the task force began focusing on the growing body of physical evidence. Detectives collected biological samples from several victims, including traces of semen found on their bodies. At the time, DNA technology was still in its infancy, but investigators knew that preserving this evidence would be critical in the future. Another potential breakthrough came in 1987, when Gary Ridgway was first identified as a possible suspect. Several witnesses had reported seeing him in the areas where victims had disappeared, and he fit the general profile of the killer. A quiet, unassuming man with access to a truck. Ridgway voluntarily submitted to a polygraph test, which he passed, though experts would later question the reliability of the results. Detectives also collected saliva and hair samples from him, but without the advanced DNA testing available today, they were unable to make a definitive connection. Ridgway was released, free to continue his killing spree. Despite their frustrations, the Green River Task Force continued to meticulously document every piece of evidence, knowing that one day, technology might catch up with the killer. Among the key pieces of evidence collected during the investigation were biological samples. Semen recovered from several victims was preserved for future testing. This would later prove to be the most damning evidence against Ridgway. Witness testimony. Survivors and sex workers who had narrowly escaped described a man who was polite, soft-spoken, and persistent. He often showed them pictures of his son to appear harmless, a tactic that lowered their defenses. Geographical patterns. Ridgway's dump sites revealed a clear pattern. He favored areas near the Green River, dense woods, and secluded ravines, places where the bodies would be hidden but still accessible for him to revisit. Ligature marks, the consistent use of makeshift ligatures, often fashioned from the victim's clothing, provided forensic experts with clues about the killer's methods. Truck sightings. Multiple witnesses had seen a pickup truck near the locations where victims were last seen. Ridgway's truck, which he used for work as a painter, became a key focus of the investigation. The killer's dual life. What made Gary Ridgway so difficult to catch was his ability to lead a double life. By day, he was a mild-mannered man who worked at Kenworth Trucking as a painter, a job he held for more than 30 years. His co-workers described him as quiet but reliable, someone who kept to himself and avoided conflict. He was married to his third wife, Judith Mawson, who later said she had no idea she was living with a monster. To her, Ridgway was a loving husband who enjoyed barbecues, church, and spending time at home. But by night, Ridgway prowled the streets of Pacific Highway South, searching for his next victim. He knew how to blend in, how to appear harmless, and how to manipulate women into trusting him. His ability to compartmentalize his life allowed him to evade suspicion for years, even as the bodies continued to pile up. For the detectives working the case, the lack of progress was agonizing. Dave Reichert, in particular, felt the weight of every unsolved murder. "We saw these women as more than victims," he later said. "We saw them as daughters, mothers, sisters, people who deserved justice." But the killer remained out of reach, a shadow that taunted them at every turn. By the late 1980s, the Green River killings seemed to taper off. Some speculated that the killer had moved on or been imprisoned for another crime. Others feared he had simply gotten better at hiding his victims. In truth, Gary Ridgway had not stopped killing. He had merely slowed his pace, confident that he would never be caught. The late 1980s became a quieter time for the Green River Task Force, but it wasn't because the killings had stopped. Gary Ridgway had simply refined his methods. Over the years, he had learned to adapt. The media frenzy and increased police patrols along Pacific Highway South forced him to be more cautious. He began spacing out his murders, choosing new dump sites deeper in the woods, and becoming even more meticulous in ensuring that he left no witnesses. For Ridgway, killing wasn't just a compulsion, it was an art he was perfecting. The women Ridgway targeted during this period were, like those before, prostitutes, runaways, and vulnerable women who existed in the shadows of society. He had become a master at luring them into his truck, his calm demeanor disarming even the most wary. His quiet voice, his fake warmth, and the picture of his young son were his tools of deception. Ridgway had developed a chilling routine. After gaining their trust, he would drive them to a secluded area, promising to pay them for sex. Once they were isolated, he would strike. He preferred strangulation. It was personal, intimate, and quiet. He didn't need a weapon. He used his own hands, or whatever was readily available, like a piece of their clothing. He later admitted to detectives that he found strangling his victims to be sexually gratifying, often climaxing during or immediately after the act. After each murder, Ridgway would discard the body in a location he had carefully scouted beforehand. Some were left in clusters, the bodies dumped together in wooded ravines or shallow graves. In other cases, he deliberately spread them out to confuse investigators. But the most disturbing part of Ridgway's routine was what came after. He would revisit the bodies, sometimes days later, sometimes weeks. He would return to the dump sites to engage in necrophilia, his twisted mind finding pleasure in the lifeless forms of his victims. He later told investigators that he didn't see his victims as people. They were objects to him, nothing more than something to control, violate, and discard. Though Ridgway became more careful, the bodies still turned up, each discovery adding to the horrific mosaic of his crimes. The victims' stories were tragically similar, yet each woman had a life, a voice, and dreams that were snuffed out by Ridgway's monstrous hands. Patricia Yellowrobe, 38, was last seen in January 1998. A Native American woman who had struggled with addiction, Patricia was found in a wooded area months later. Her family described her as a kind, loving woman who had fallen on hard times but didn't deserve to be forgotten. April Dawn Buttram, 17, disappeared in August 1983. She was a runaway who had been trying to make her way in the world when she crossed paths with Ridgway. Her remains were not discovered until 2003, nearly 20 years later, when Ridgway confessed and led investigators to her location. Kelly McGinnis, 18, vanished in 1983. Her skeletal remains were discovered years later in a desolate, wooded area. Kelly had been a high school dropout who dreamed of becoming a nurse. That dream died with her. One of Ridgway's youngest victims was Sandra K. Gabbert, just 17 years old. She had been living on the streets after running away from home. She was last seen getting into a truck near Pacific Highway South in 1983. Her body was found months later in a shallow grave, her clothes discarded nearby like trash. The stories repeated themselves, each one a haunting echo of the last. The women were vulnerable, overlooked by society, and easy prey for Ridgway. He knew they wouldn't be missed right away. He counted on it. By 1988, the body count had climbed to more than 40, but the Green River Task Force was no closer to catching the killer. Each discovery brought frustration and heartbreak. Detectives painstakingly mapped out where the victims had been found, hoping to identify a pattern. They interviewed hundreds of men who had been seen in the area, collected countless forensic samples, and even brought in criminal profilers to help build a psychological picture of the killer. The profile painted a chilling image. The killer was likely a white male in his late 20s to early 40s. He was organized, intelligent, and methodical. He lived or worked near the area where the victims disappeared, and he likely had a blue-collar job that allowed him to move around unnoticed. He had a deep hatred for women, particularly prostitutes, and derived sexual pleasure from their deaths. The profile was accurate, but it did little to narrow down the list of suspects. Detective Dave Reichert, who had been with the case since the beginning, became increasingly frustrated. "It felt like we were chasing a ghost," he later said. "Every time we thought we had him, he slipped through our fingers." In 1987, Reichert and his team thought they might finally have a breakthrough. Gary Ridgway, a local man who had been seen frequenting the areas where many of the victims had disappeared, was brought in for questioning. Ridgway was calm and cooperative, answering the detectives' questions without hesitation. He even passed a polygraph test when asked if he had killed any of the women. Without solid evidence, the task force had no choice but to let him go. What they didn't know was that Ridgway had already killed dozens of women, and he wasn't done yet. Ridgway believed he was untouchable. The fact that he had been questioned and released only emboldened him. He continued to kill, though at a slower pace, spacing out his murders to avoid drawing attention. He began dumping bodies further away from the Green River, in more remote locations that he believed would never be found. And for years he was right. Ridgway's arrogance was evident in the way he spoke about his crimes years later. "I thought I'd never get caught," he told detectives after his arrest. "I was smarter than the cops. I knew how to hide the bodies where they'd never look." He took pride in his ability to outsmart the police, to lead a double life that no one suspected. By day, he was a devoted husband and father. By night, he was a predator, stalking the streets for his next victim. For years, the Green River Task Force was plagued by dead ends. But in 2001, advances in DNA technology finally gave investigators the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Biological samples collected from several victims in the 1980s were retested using modern methods. The results were conclusive. The DNA matched Gary Ridgway. Detective Reichert, who had spent nearly 2 decades chasing the Green River Killer, finally had his answer. "When the DNA came back, it was like the world stopped," he said. "We had him. After all those years, we finally had him." Ridgway was arrested on November 30th, 2001, outside the Kenworth trucking plant where he worked. He didn't resist. In fact, he seemed almost relieved. "It's about time," he reportedly said as he was handcuffed and placed in the back of a squad car. When Gary Ridgway was arrested on November 30th, 2001, the Green River Task Force had no doubt they had their man. The DNA evidence was irrefutable, directly linking him to the murders of at least 4 women. After nearly 2 decades of chasing shadows, the investigators finally had the Green River Killer in custody. But no one was prepared for the scope of the horror Ridgway would reveal in the weeks that followed. Ridgway, soft-spoken and eerily cooperative, sat across from detectives in the interrogation room. When faced with the DNA evidence, he didn't deny his crimes. In fact, he barely flinched. "You got me," he said simply, his tone devoid of emotion. It was as though he had been waiting for this moment, anticipating the day when his double life would finally crumble. For the detectives who had spent years chasing him, his calm admission was both infuriating and chilling. Detective Dave Reichert, who had been with the case since the discovery of the first bodies in 1982, described the moment as surreal. He wasn't angry, he wasn't crying, he wasn't scared. He was just blank, like he was talking about something that didn't even matter. The breakthrough in the case came from DNA technology that had advanced significantly since the 1980s. During the initial investigation, semen samples had been collected from several victims, but at the time, forensic science lacked the precision needed to link them to a suspect. Those samples had been carefully preserved, however, and by 2001, they could finally be tested using modern DNA profiling techniques. The samples from 3 victims, Marcia Chapman, Opal Mills, and Carol Christensen, yielded the same result, a definitive match to Gary Leon Ridgway. A 4th sample, taken from debris recovered near Wendy Caulfield, also linked Ridgway to her murder. It was a watershed moment in the case. "We had him dead to rights," said Detective Tom Jensen, who had joined the task force in the mid-1980s. "The DNA didn't just put him at the crime scenes, it tied him directly to the women. There was no way out for him. But the DNA was only the beginning." Detectives had long suspected Ridgway, and over the years, they had quietly built a mountain of circumstantial evidence against him. Witnesses had reported seeing him in areas where victims were last seen, and several survivors had described encounters with a man matching his description. A key piece of evidence came from Ridgway's own truck, a green Dodge pickup with a distinctive canopy that had been spotted near several of the dump sites. Though the evidence hadn't been enough to arrest him in the 1980s, it now painted a damning picture when combined with the DNA results. Ridgway's behavior at work also raised red flags. Several co-workers at Kenworth Trucking described him as a strange but unremarkable man who often talked about prostitutes in a derogatory way. He'd make these offhand comments about how women who worked the streets didn't deserve respect, one co-worker later recalled. At the time, you just thought he was being crude. But looking back, it makes you wonder how no one saw it. Once the DNA evidence was presented to him, Ridgway began to talk. What started as a trickle of admissions soon became a flood of horrifying revelations. Over the course of several weeks, Ridgway confessed to killing 49 women, though he later claimed the actual number was closer to 70 or 80. "I killed so many women, I lost count," he told detectives in one chilling interview. His confessions were delivered in a flat, emotionless tone, as though he were recounting mundane details of his day. He described how he would troll Pacific Highway South in his truck, looking for vulnerable women, prostitutes, runaways, and women struggling with addiction. He would approach them with a friendly demeanor, often showing them pictures of his young son to put them at ease. Once they agreed to get into his truck, their fate was sealed. "I'd tell them I wanted sex," Ridgway explained. "We'd drive somewhere quiet. They'd think I was just another John. But then I'd strangle them." Ridgway's preferred method of killing was as personal as it was brutal. He would often strangle his victims with his hands, watching the life drain from their eyes. In some cases, he used ligatures, such as their own clothing or a piece of rope he kept in his truck. He claimed he chose strangulation because it was quiet and allowed him to feel in control. "I liked it," he admitted. "It made me feel powerful." Ridgway also confessed to revisiting the dump sites days, or even weeks after the murders. He would return to the bodies to engage in necrophilia, claiming that it satisfied his urges without the risk of being caught with another living victim. "They couldn't say no," he said, his words sending a chill through the room. One of the most valuable aspects of Ridgway's confessions was his willingness to lead investigators to the bodies of his victims. Many of the women he killed had never been found, their families left in agonizing limbo for years. Ridgway, in his twisted way, seemed almost eager to show the detectives where he had hidden them. Over several months, Ridgway accompanied detectives to remote locations across King County, pointing out shallow graves and wooded ravines where he had discarded his victims. Many of the sites were eerily pristine, untouched since the day he had left the bodies there. In some cases, skeletal remains were all that remained, scattered by animals or buried beneath years of debris. Detectives were struck by Ridgway's memory. Even after decades, he was able to recall specific details about the locations and the women he had killed there. He could describe exactly where he left them, what they were wearing, how they looked when he killed them, said Detective Jensen. It was horrifying to hear, but it gave us the answers we needed to bring closure to their families. One of the most poignant discoveries came when Ridgway led investigators to the remains of April Dawn Buttram, a 17-year-old runaway who had disappeared in 1983. For nearly 20 years, her family had held on to the hope that she might still be alive. Ridgway's confession shattered that hope, but it also provided the Buttrams with the truth they had been searching for. "We finally knew what happened to her," April's sister said. "It wasn't the answer we wanted, but at least we knew." When asked why he killed, Ridgway's answers were as chilling as they were simple. "I hated prostitutes," he said. "I hated them because they didn't deserve to live. They were easy to pick up, easy to kill, and no one cared about them." But Ridgway's hatred of women ran deeper than just his disdain for sex workers. He spoke often of his mother, Mary Ridgway, describing her as overbearing, controlling, and sexually inappropriate. He admitted that he had been both aroused and humiliated by her behavior, a toxic combination that seemed to fuel his later crimes. "I think a lot of it goes back to her," he said. Detectives and psychologists who interviewed Ridgway described him as a deeply disturbed individual who lacked empathy and saw his victims as objects rather than people. "He didn't see them as human beings," said one profiler. "To him, they were just things he could control, kill, and dispose of." The arrest and confessions of Gary Ridgway sent shockwaves through the community. For years, he had been the faceless predator who haunted the Pacific Northwest, leaving behind a trail of broken lives and unanswered questions. Now the families of his victims, and the world, would finally face the man who had come to be known as the Green River Killer. Ridgway's trial was set to be one of the most significant in U.S. criminal history, not just because of the scale of his crimes, but because of the horrifying details he revealed during his confessions. As prosecutors prepared their case, the sheer volume of evidence was staggering. From the DNA samples that had finally exposed him to his chillingly specific recollections of each murder, it was clear that Ridgway would have no chance of avoiding conviction. But what no one expected was what would happen next. In 2003, Gary Ridgway stunned prosecutors, detectives, and the public by agreeing to a plea deal. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, Ridgway would plead guilty to the murders of 48 women and agree to cooperate fully with investigators. The plea deal was controversial. A man who had taken so many lives was being offered the chance to keep his own. But for the families of the victims, the deal offered something that had eluded them for decades: answers. King County prosecutor Norm Malling defended the decision, explaining that the plea deal would allow investigators to recover as many remains as possible and bring closure to more families. "We had to make a choice," Malling said. "Do we pursue the death penalty, or do we get the answers these families have been waiting for? In the end, justice is about more than punishment, it's about truth." The deal was met with mixed emotions. Some families were relieved to finally know what had happened to their loved ones, while others were outraged that Ridgway's life would be spared. "He didn't give my daughter a choice," said the mother of one victim. "Why should he get one?" On November 5, 2003, Gary Ridgway stood in a packed courtroom and pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. His voice was monotone, devoid of emotion, as he recited the names of his victims one by one. The list was long, each name a reminder of a life that had been stolen. Wendy Lee Caulfield, 16. Deborah Bonner, 23. Marcia Chapman, 31. Opal Mills, 16. And dozens more. For the families who had gathered in the courtroom, hearing their loved ones' names read aloud by the man who had killed them was almost unbearable. Some wept openly, while others glared at Ridgway with a hatred that could barely be contained. One woman, the sister of a victim, stood up and shouted, "You're a coward," before being escorted from the courtroom. Ridgway's lack of remorse was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the proceedings. When asked why he had killed, he simply shrugged. "I just wanted to," he said. "It was easy." His words were delivered with the same flat tone he had used throughout his confessions, as though he were describing a trip to the grocery store rather than the murder of 48 women. During the sentencing phase, the families of Ridgway's victims were given the chance to speak. Their testimonies were raw, emotional, and devastating. Mothers and fathers spoke of the children they had lost. Sisters and brothers described the holes left in their families, and friends shared memories of happier times that had been stolen by Ridgway's cruelty. One of the most powerful moments came when Marie Malvar's father, Jose Malvar, addressed Ridgway directly. Marie, a 19-year-old who disappeared in 1983, had been one of Ridgway's many victims. Her father had spent years searching for her, even driving along Pacific Highway South with her picture, hoping for a clue. "You took my baby," he said, his voice shaking. "You took her from this world, and you left us with nothing. I hope you remember her face every day for the rest of your life." Another emotional moment came when Opal Mills's mother stood before the court. Opal had been just 16 years old when Ridgway killed her and dumped her body near the Green River. Her mother, who had carried the weight of her daughter's death for more than 20 years, looked Ridgway in the eye and said, "You didn't just kill our daughters, you killed our spirits." But we won't let you win. We'll remember them for who they were, not for what you did. As part of his plea deal, Ridgway agreed to cooperate fully with investigators, providing details about his crimes and leading them to the remains of additional victims. Over the course of several months, he accompanied detectives to remote locations where he had disposed of bodies, sometimes crawling on his hands and knees to point out shallow graves. One of Ridgway's most shocking admissions came during these sessions. When asked why he had killed so many women, he said, "I thought I was doing the world a favor." He described how he viewed prostitutes as garbage and believed he was cleansing society by killing them. His words revealed the depth of his depravity, a man who had justified his heinous acts with a warped sense of morality. In total, Ridgway admitted to killing at least 71 women, though he claimed he couldn't remember the exact number. He said he had stopped counting after the first 20. "I didn't keep track because it didn't matter," he said. "They didn't mean anything to me." On December 18, 2003, Gary Ridgway was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He received 48 consecutive life sentences, one for each of the women he had admitted to killing. As the judge read the sentence, Ridgway stood motionless, showing no emotion. For him, it was just another day. In his final statement to the court, Ridgway apologized to the families of his victims. But his words rang hollow. "I'm sorry for what I've done," he said. "I know I've caused a lot of pain. I hope you can find it in your hearts to forgive me." For the families, his apology was too little too late. "He doesn't deserve forgiveness," said the mother of one victim. "He deserves to rot." Gary Ridgway's crimes left an indelible mark on the Pacific Northwest. For years, his name would be synonymous with terror, a reminder of the evil that can lurk behind the most ordinary facade. But his arrest and conviction also brought a measure of closure to the families of his victims and to the detectives who had spent decades chasing him. Detective Dave Reichert, who had dedicated much of his career to the case, reflected on the long journey to justice. "There were times when we thought we'd never catch him," he said. "But we never gave up. We owed it to the women who lost their lives. We owed it to their families." Today, Gary Ridgway sits in a cell, serving out his life sentence at the Washington State Penitentiary. He spends his days in isolation, far from the streets where he once hunted his victims. For the families of the women he killed, his imprisonment is a small comfort, a reminder that even the most cunning monsters can be brought to justice. Though Gary Ridgway's name will forever be remembered, it is the names of his victims that should truly endure. Wendy, Marcia, Opal, Deborah, and the dozens of others who fell into his clutches were more than just numbers on a list. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends. Their lives mattered, and their stories deserved to be told. Story 2. The Moscow Park was eerily quiet as the police squad moved into position. The heavily wooded area of Bitsa Park was a labyrinth of trees and shadows, a place where the unspeakable had happened time and time again. For years, people had whispered about the disappearances, the men and women who vanished without a trace after entering the park. But tonight, the whispers would end. Just past midnight on June 16, 2006, officers waited, concealed in the underbrush, their breath visible in the cold night air. They had been tipped off by a colleague of Alexander Pichushkin, a 32-year-old man who worked at a local supermarket. The woman had grown suspicious after Pichushkin, a quiet and peculiar man, made comments about the bodies he claimed to have buried in the park. A subsequent investigation had revealed a chilling pattern, and now police were watching him, hoping to catch him in the act. Pichushkin was walking through the park, a small glass vodka bottle clutched in his hand. He had an unremarkable appearance, average height, slightly stocky, with close-cropped blonde hair and a face that betrayed nothing of the darkness within. He moved with purpose, scanning his surroundings as he approached a bench where his latest victim, a homeless man he had befriended, sat waiting. The man was drunk, laughing as Pichushkin handed him the vodka bottle and encouraged him to drink more. The officers watched in silence as Pichushkin bent down to retrieve something from his bag. A hammer. He moved quickly, raising the weapon above his head. The officers didn't hesitate. They burst out of the darkness, their shouts cutting through the stillness of the park. Pichushkin dropped the hammer and froze, his hands in the air. There was no struggle. He didn't even look surprised. As they handcuffed him, one of the officers asked, "Do you know why we're arresting you?" Pichushkin turned his head slowly, meeting the officer's gaze with an unsettling calmness. "Because of the chessboard," he said. "It's not finished yet." The officers exchanged confused looks, but they would soon learn the horrifying meaning of his words. In Pichushkin's apartment, they would find a chessboard with 61 of its 64 squares marked with dates. Each marked square represented a life he had taken, and he had been determined to fill the entire board. By the early 1990s, the isolation and bitterness that consumed Alexander Pichushkin had become unbearable. The years of rejection, ridicule, and loneliness had hardened his psyche, turning his fantasies of domination and death into an obsession. At the age of 18, Pichushkin crossed an invisible, irreversible boundary. In 1992, he committed his first murder, an act that would lay the foundation for what would become one of the most infamous killing sprees in Russian history. Pichushkin's first victim was Mikhail Odachuk, a former classmate who had once humiliated him in front of their peers. Pichushkin had held onto that grudge for years, and with no outlet for his simmering rage, he decided to take revenge. In the spring of 1992, Pichushkin approached Odachuk, pretending to rekindle their old friendship. He suggested they take a walk through Bitsa Park, a sprawling and heavily wooded area on the outskirts of Moscow. Unknown to Odachuk, Pichushkin had already chosen the park as the perfect place to kill. It was vast, secluded, and silent, a place where screams would go unheard. As they walked deeper into the forest, Pichushkin's demeanor shifted. He became quiet, tense, and his steps slowed as they neared the spot he had chosen. When the moment felt right, he struck. Using a blunt object, likely a hammer, which would become his weapon of choice, he attacked Odachuk from behind, delivering several powerful blows to his skull. The first strike stunned Odachuk, sending him crumpling to the ground. The subsequent strikes shattered his skull, leaving blood pooling beneath him on the forest floor. Pichushkin later described the act as a test, something he needed to do to prove to himself that he had the courage to take a life. "I wanted to know if I could do it," he said during his confession years later. "I wanted to see what it felt like to kill." But instead of the satisfaction he had imagined, Pichushkin was overwhelmed by panic. His hands shook as he stood over the lifeless body, the reality of what he had done sinking in. Fearing discovery, he fled the scene, leaving the body behind and spending the following weeks in a state of paranoia. He avoided Bitsa Park entirely, convinced that the police would find the body and trace it back to him. But when no one came knocking on his door, the fear gave way to a dangerous realization. He had gotten away with murder. The realization emboldened him, planting the seed for what would later become an uncontrollable compulsion. After his first kill, Pichushkin appeared to retreat into the shadows. For nearly a decade, there were no confirmed murders tied to him, though some investigators believe he may have killed during this period. Later, during his confession, Pichushkin was vague about this quiet period, only saying that his urges never went away. "It stayed with me," he said. "The need to kill was always there waiting." What is certain is that by the early 2000s, Pichushkin had refined his methods and was ready to begin killing in earnest. He had chosen Bitsa Park as his hunting ground, a place he knew intimately. The dense trees and winding paths provided the perfect cover, and the park's isolation made it easy to lure victims without drawing attention. In 2001, Pichushkin committed the first of what would become dozens of murders, each one carried out with chilling precision. His victims were often vulnerable individuals, homeless men, alcoholics, and elderly pensioners, people who would not be missed. Pichushkin deliberately targeted these individuals, knowing their disappearances would attract little attention from the authorities. One of his early victims was Sergei, a man Pichushkin had met while playing chess in the park. Sergei was a regular at the chess tables, an older man who enjoyed the game but often drank too much during matches. Pichushkin befriended him, chatting about strategy and offering to share drinks. Over time, Sergei came to trust Pichushkin, seeing him as a harmless young man with a passion for chess. One evening, Pichushkin suggested they take their game to a quieter spot in the park. Sergei agreed, bringing a bottle of vodka to share. As they played, Pichushkin encouraged Sergei to drink heavily, refilling his glass over and over. When Sergei was too drunk to stand, Pichushkin made his move. Using a hammer, Pichushkin struck Sergei repeatedly in the back of the head, the sound of the blows muffled by the forest around them. He then dragged Sergei's body to a nearby sewer well and pushed it inside. The body disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the labyrinth of tunnels beneath the park. Pichushkin later described the act as clean and satisfying, saying, "The sewer became my accomplice. It hid the evidence for me." While most of Pichushkin's victims were men, he occasionally targeted women. One of his most infamous victims was Marina Moskaliva, a 36-year-old woman who worked as a cashier. Marina had known Pichushkin casually, and when he invited her for a walk in the park, she accepted, unaware of his true intentions. Unlike his other victims, Marina left a trail. Before meeting Pichushkin, she wrote a note to her son, telling him where she was going and who she was meeting. It was a small act, but one that would later prove crucial in linking Pichushkin to her disappearance. As they walked through Bitsa Park, Pichushkin followed his usual script, offering Marina vodka and encouraging her to drink. When she was sufficiently intoxicated, he struck, delivering several blows to her head with his hammer. Afterward, he discarded her body in the woods, hiding it beneath a pile of leaves. When Marina failed to return home, her son contacted the police, providing them with the note she had left behind. The information led investigators to Pichushkin, though it would take months of surveillance and evidence gathering before they could make an arrest. Another of Pichushkin's victims was an elderly man, a retired pensioner who often wandered the park feeding birds. Pichushkin approached him one afternoon, striking up a conversation about chess and offering him a drink. He lured the man to a secluded area, where he attacked him with a hammer. But this time, Pichushkin didn't stop there. In a particularly gruesome twist, he shoved a broken vodka bottle into the man's skull, leaving the glass protruding from the wound. When asked later why he had done this, Pichushkin replied, "I wanted to make sure he would never get back up. It was my way of finishing the game." As the murders piled up, Pichushkin's need to kill became insatiable. He described the act as a drug, saying, "The more I killed, the more I wanted to kill. It became my life." He began killing more frequently, sometimes targeting multiple victims in a single week. By the end of 2005, the body count had risen to over 40, though the police had yet to connect the murders. The vastness of Bitsa Park, combined with the transient nature of many of the victims, made it difficult for investigators to establish a clear pattern. Pichushkin, meanwhile, felt unstoppable. He kept meticulous records of his crimes, marking each murder on his chessboard with a date. "Each square represented a life," he said. "I wanted to fill the whole board." The murders in Bitsa Park had gone unnoticed for years. Victims disappeared quietly, their bodies either hidden or misclassified by overworked authorities as accidents, suicides, or the result of drunken brawls. It wasn't until 2005 that the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, thanks to a combination of dogged police work, forensic evidence, and one critical mistake by Alexander Pichushkin himself. What started as whispers about a string of deaths in the park soon became the largest criminal investigation Moscow had seen since Andrei Chikatilo, the infamous butcher of Rostov. The police, initially skeptical of any connection between the deaths, quickly realized they were dealing with a predator unlike anything they had encountered before. Bitsa Park, a sprawling 2,700-acre forest on the outskirts of Moscow, was a place where many of society's forgotten lived and died. Homeless men, alcoholics, and the lonely elderly often sought refuge there, and the park's vastness made it easy for crimes to go unnoticed. Throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, bodies began to turn up in and around the park. Many were found with severe head trauma, their skulls crushed or shattered, and some were discovered in sewer wells or shallow graves. However, the randomness of the victims and the lack of witnesses made it difficult to connect the dots. The police initially chalked the deaths up to drunken accidents or robberies gone wrong. At the time, there was no indication that these were connected, one investigator later said. "We were dealing with vulnerable people who often lived on the fringes of society. Their deaths didn't raise alarms because they were seen as isolated incidents. But as the years passed and the body count rose, the pattern became harder to ignore. Most of the victims were killed in similar ways, their injuries indicating blunt force trauma to the head. Many had been drinking shortly before their deaths, and nearly all were last seen in or near Bitsa Park. The case that broke everything open was the murder of Marina Moskaliva in 2006. Unlike many of Pichushkin's previous victims, Marina was not homeless or destitute. She was a 36-year-old cashier, a single mother with a teenage son. Her murder would ultimately lead police directly to Pichushkin. On the day of her disappearance, Marina left a note for her son, telling him she was going for a walk with a friend named Alexander. She even included his phone number. When Marina failed to return home that evening, her son, alarmed by her absence, contacted the police and handed them the note. The police traced the phone number to Alexander Pichushkin, a supermarket employee who lived nearby. Though Pichushkin initially denied knowing Marina, investigators found surveillance footage from the metro station, showing the two walking together on the day she disappeared. Days later, Marina's body was found in Bitsa Park. Her skull had been shattered by multiple blows to the head, and her body had been partially concealed under leaves and debris. The brutality of the crime matched the pattern of other recent murders in the park, and for the first time, police had a suspect. With Pichushkin now on their radar, investigators began combing through unsolved cases in and around Bitsa Park. What they found was chilling. Over the past 5 years, dozens of bodies had been discovered in the park, many with similar injuries. Blunt force trauma to the head, often inflicted with a hammer or other heavy object. The victims were overwhelmingly male, though there were exceptions, and most had been drinking shortly before their deaths. Some bodies had been pushed into sewer wells, while others had been left in shallow graves or concealed with debris. The randomness of the victims, ranging from elderly pensioners to homeless men to a young woman like Marina, had initially made it difficult to establish a clear motive or link between the cases. But now, with Pichushkin as the prime suspect, everything began to fall into place. The chessboard discovery. When police searched Pichushkin's apartment, they uncovered the most damning piece of evidence: a chessboard with 61 of its 64 squares marked with dates. Each date corresponded to a murder he had committed, a macabre tally of human lives taken. The chessboard became the centerpiece of the investigation, giving Pichushkin the nickname, the Chessboard Killer. In his later confessions, Pichushkin revealed that his ultimate goal had been to fill all 64 squares, one for each victim. "The chessboard was my world," he said. "I wanted to complete it. It was my destiny." Alongside the chessboard, police found notebooks in which Pichushkin had written detailed accounts of his killings. The entries were chillingly methodical, listing the names of victims when known, the dates of their deaths, and the methods he had used to kill them. The forensic evidence. As investigators dug deeper, they began to uncover forensic evidence linking Pichushkin to several of the murders. DNA evidence. In some cases, traces of Pichushkin's DNA were found on the victim's clothing or belongings. This was particularly true for cases where he had physically moved or concealed the bodies. The hammer. A hammer found in Pichushkin's apartment matched the injuries sustained by several victims. Forensic analysis confirmed that the shape and size of the weapon were consistent with the blunt force trauma seen in the victims' autopsies. Sewer wells. Investigators conducted a sweep of sewer wells in and around Bitsa Park, recovering several bodies that had been reported missing in previous years. The state of decomposition made identification difficult, but in some cases, personal belongings or dental records allowed police to confirm the identities of the victims. Witness statements. Pichushkin had been seen with several victims shortly before their disappearances. Witnesses described him as friendly and unassuming, a man who often offered drinks or companionship to those in need. The psychological profile. As the evidence mounted, criminal profilers were brought in to analyze Pichushkin's behavior and motives. They concluded that he was a highly organized killer who chose his victims carefully, targeting those who were unlikely to be missed. Pichushkin's method of luring victims, befriending them, offering alcohol, and then striking when they were most vulnerable, showed a cold, calculated approach. He was a predator who thrived on manipulation and control. "There is no question that he enjoyed the act of killing," one profiler said. For him, it wasn't just about the chessboard or the numbers. It was about power. He saw himself as a god, deciding who lived and who died. By the summer of 2006, police had built a strong case against Pichushkin. They had physical evidence, witness testimonies, and a confession that would later shock the nation. But Pichushkin's arrest was only the beginning. The full scope of his crimes and the horrifying details he would reveal during his trial would leave even seasoned investigators reeling. When Alexander Pichushkin was arrested in June 2006, the Moscow police faced an overwhelming task, piecing together over a decade of unsolved murders, many of which had been dismissed or overlooked, and proving that one man was responsible. The evidence they had gathered so far, the chessboard, the hammer, Pichushkin's confessions, was damning, but the scale of the crimes presented a challenge unlike anything the detectives had dealt with before. The investigation into Pichushkin's murders became one of the largest and most meticulously documented cases in Russian history. Every piece of evidence, no matter how small, was scrutinized. Every victim had to be identified, their final moments reconstructed, and their deaths linked to Pichushkin beyond a shadow of a doubt. The first hurdle investigators faced was the sheer number of victims. Pichushkin had confessed to killing 61 people, but the bodies of many had yet to be discovered. Some had been dumped into sewer wells, their remains unrecoverable. Others had decomposed beyond recognition, leaving little forensic evidence to tie them to their killer. Detective Ivan Smirnov, one of the lead investigators, described the daunting nature of the case. When we arrested him, we thought we were dealing with maybe a dozen murders. Then he started talking, and we realized the scale of what he had done. It was like trying to solve 61 puzzles at once, but most of the pieces were missing. The chessboard found in Pichushkin's apartment quickly became the centerpiece of the case. Investigators noted that 61 squares had been marked with dates that corresponded to murders Pichushkin had committed. But 3 squares were left blank, a haunting reminder of his unfinished game. Forensic psychologist Ekaterina Morozova, who worked with the police, recalled the chilling moment she first saw the chessboard. It was more than just a record of his crimes. It was his trophy. Every square represented a life he had taken, and he took pride in it. When I asked him why he didn't stop at 10 or 20, he said, "Why stop when you can fill the whole board?" Pichushkin himself was eager to explain the significance of the chessboard. During interrogations, he described it as a symbol of his mastery over life and death. "For me, life is like a chess game," he told investigators. "Every move is calculated. Every piece has its place. The goal is to win, and I was winning." One of the most horrifying aspects of Pichushkin's crimes was his use of sewer wells to dispose of his victims. After bludgeoning them to death, he would drag their bodies to the nearest well and push them inside. The wells, deep and dark, acted as natural graves, making it nearly impossible for anyone to discover the bodies. Detectives conducted a series of sweeps in and around Bitsa Park, lowering cameras into the wells to search for remains. In one particularly gruesome discovery, they found the decomposed bodies of 3 men in the same well, all victims of Pichushkin. The recovery process was harrowing, with officers forced to descend into the narrow, foul-smelling shafts to retrieve the remains. Lieutenant Yuri Karpov, who oversaw the recovery efforts, later said, "It was like descending into hell. The smell, the darkness, it was unbearable. But we knew we had to bring those bodies out. They weren't just evidence, they were people who deserved to be found." Reconstructing the murders required a combination of forensic science, witness testimonies, and Pichushkin's own confessions. Investigators worked tirelessly to map out his movements, identify his victims, and piece together their final moments. One of the most critical pieces of evidence came from surveillance footage taken at a metro station near Bitsa Park. The footage showed Pichushkin walking with several of his victims shortly before their disappearances, providing a visual link between him and the crimes. Detective Smirnov described the importance of the footage. The video showed him leading these people to their deaths. It was like watching a spider lure flies into its web. He looked so ordinary, so unassuming, and that's what made him so dangerous. No one suspected what he was capable of. One of the most significant breakthroughs in the case came from a woman who had narrowly escaped Pichushkin's clutches. She described how he had invited her to drink vodka in Bitsa Park, but became aggressive when she refused to get drunk. Sensing danger, she fled, leaving Pichushkin behind. Her testimony provided investigators with valuable insights into his methods. She described him as charming at first, but his demeanor would change as soon as he felt he had control over his victim. He was like 2 different people, she told police. One moment he was friendly, and the next there was something in his eyes, something terrifying. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the investigation was Pichushkin's willingness to confess. After his arrest, he spoke freely about his crimes, often smiling as he described the details. He seemed proud of what he had done, eager to take credit for the lives he had taken. In one interrogation session, Pichushkin told detectives, "For me, killing was like a game. Each person was a move on the board. Some moves were easy, some were harder. But in the end, I always won." Detective Smirnov recalled the unsettling nature of Pichushkin's confessions. He talked about murder the way someone might talk about their favorite hobby. There was no remorse, no regret, just pride. It was like he wanted us to admire his work. It was sickening. As the evidence piled up, the weight of the case began to take its toll on the officers involved. Many struggled with the sheer scale of the crimes and the brutality of what they were uncovering. Sergeant Volkov described the emotional toll. "You try not to think about the victims as people, because if you do, it becomes unbearable. But then you see their pictures, you hear their families talk about them, and it hits you. These were real people with lives, and he took all of that away. It's something you never forget." Despite the challenges, the team remained determined to bring Pichushkin to justice. Their work was methodical, exhaustive, and ultimately successful. By the time the case was ready to go to trial, prosecutors had assembled a mountain of evidence, ensuring that Pichushkin would never walk free again. When the verdict was read, the courtroom erupted in emotion. Some family members wept openly, while others shouted curses at Pichushkin. He remained expressionless, his eyes fixed on the chessboard that had been displayed throughout the trial. The trial of Alexander Pichushkin left an indelible mark on Russia. It was not just the scale of his crimes, but the cold, calculated way he had carried them out that horrified the public. For many, Bitsa Park would forever be associated with the chessboard killer, a place where innocence had been lost and lives had been stolen. As one detective put it, "We caught him, but the damage he caused can never be undone. There are families who will never heal, lives that will never be the same. And for what? So he could feel like a god. It's unthinkable." As the dust settled on Alexander Pichushkin's trial, one question loomed larger than any other. Why? What could drive a man to commit such heinous crimes, to prey on the vulnerable without a shred of remorse, and to treat human life as nothing more than a game? In the months following his conviction, forensic psychologists, criminologists, and journalists began to piece together the fractured psyche of the man who had come to be known as the chessboard killer. To understand Pichushkin's crimes, investigators delved into his childhood, searching for the roots of his murderous impulses. Born in 1974, Pichushkin grew up in Moscow, raised primarily by his mother after his father abandoned the family when he was still a toddler. By all accounts, his early years were marked by isolation and struggle. At the age of 4, Pichushkin suffered a severe head injury after falling backward off a swing. The blow was so forceful that it caused damage to his frontal lobe, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control, decision-making, and empathy. Neurologists would later suggest that this injury may have been a critical factor in shaping his violent tendencies. Dr. Ekaterina Morozova, a forensic psychologist who studied Pichushkin's case, explained, "Damage to the frontal lobe can profoundly affect a person's ability to regulate their emotions and control their behavior. Combine that with a lack of support or intervention during his formative years, and you have the perfect storm for developing psychopathy." As he grew older, Pichushkin's isolation deepened. He was bullied relentlessly at school, mocked for his speech impediment and awkward demeanor. Classmates described him as quiet and withdrawn, a boy who always seemed to be on the fringes of social life. One former classmate recalled, "He was invisible to most people, but when he did speak, there was something unsettling about him. He didn't get angry when people teased him. He just watched them, like he was waiting for something." Pichushkin's love of chess became one of the few outlets for his restless mind. He often played at a local park, where older men taught him strategies and techniques. Chess gave him a sense of order and control, a way to channel his frustration into something productive. But as he grew older, the game took on a darker meaning. "Chess taught me how to think ahead," Pichushkin would later say. "It taught me how to plan, how to anticipate my opponent's moves. Killing was the same. It was about strategy, about getting inside someone's mind and outmaneuvering them." By the time he reached adulthood, Pichushkin's fantasies of power and domination had begun to merge with his love of chess. He envisioned himself as the master of a life-sized game, where the pieces were human beings and the board was Bitsa Park. During his interrogations, Pichushkin spoke openly about his obsession with filling all 64 squares on his chessboard. For him, the chessboard was more than just a record of his crimes. It was a symbol of his mastery over life and death. Each square was a step closer to perfection, he explained. Killing wasn't just about the act itself. It was about completing the game, about proving to myself that I could finish what I started. Psychologists believe that the chessboard obsession was a way for Pichushkin to impose order on the chaos of his life. By creating a game out of murder, he was able to justify his actions and distance himself from the reality of what he was doing. Dr. Morozova noted, "For someone like Pichushkin, the chessboard became a coping mechanism. It allowed him to compartmentalize his crimes, to see them as achievements rather than atrocities. In his mind, he wasn't a murderer, he was a strategist, a creator of order." One of the most striking aspects of Pichushkin's personality was his complete lack of remorse. Throughout his trial and subsequent interviews, he showed no empathy for his victims, no regret for the pain he had caused. Instead, he spoke of his murders with pride, as though they were accomplishments to be admired. "I don't see them as people," he said during one interrogation. They were pieces on the board. They existed to be moved, to be taken. That was their purpose. This detachment from humanity is a hallmark of psychopathy, a personality disorder characterized by a lack of empathy, remorse, and emotional connection. Pichushkin's ability to manipulate his victims, befriending them, luring them into a false sense of security, demonstrated a level of cunning that made him all the more dangerous. Following his conviction, Pichushkin was sent to IK, 6 Black Dolphin, one of Russia's most notorious high-security prisons. Located near the border with Kazakhstan, the prison is home to the country's most dangerous criminals, including serial killers, terrorists, and cannibals. In Black Dolphin, inmates are kept under constant surveillance. They are escorted everywhere with their heads bowed, hands cuffed behind their backs, and guards on either side. Pichushkin, once a man who thrived on control, now finds himself utterly powerless. Prison officials have reported that Pichushkin remains unrepentant. He spends much of his time alone, writing in notebooks and playing chess against himself. Despite his confinement, he continues to view his crimes as a source of pride. "I'm not like the others here," he reportedly told a prison psychologist. "They killed for money, for jealousy, for revenge. I killed because it was my calling. That makes me different. That makes me better." For the families of Pichushkin's victims, the scars of his crimes will never fully heal. Many have struggled to find closure, haunted by the knowledge that their loved ones were reduced to mere moves in his twisted game. One mother, whose son was murdered by Pichushkin, summed up the feelings of many. "He took everything from me, my son, my peace, my sense of safety. And yet he sits in his cell, playing chess, as if it's all just a game. How can there ever be justice for what he did?" The case of Alexander Pichushkin remains one of the darkest chapters in Russia's criminal history. It is a story of a man who turned his pain into violence, who sought power in the most grotesque way imaginable. And while he may spend the rest of his life in a cell, the shadow of his crimes continues to linger, a reminder of the depths to which the human mind can sink. Story 3. The room was dimly lit, the bare bulb above flickering as if in protest to the tension that hung heavy in the air. In the corner of the interrogation room sat Wang Chong, his hands cuffed tightly in front of him, the metal biting into his skin. Beads of sweat rolled down his forehead, but his face betrayed no emotion, a mask of eerie calm that had unsettled even the most seasoned officers in the room. Captain Zhao Wei, the lead investigator from the Hunan Provincial Police, leaned forward. His voice was steady, but his eyes burned with barely contained fury. "We know what you've done, Wang. You can keep quiet if you want, but we've already found the bodies. Each and every one of them." For a moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the faint hum of the fluorescent light. Then Wang raised his eyes, a slow, deliberate motion. His lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile, one that sent a chill down Zhao's spine. "You don't know everything," Wang said, his voice calm, almost conversational. "There are more. So many more." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. This was no ordinary killer sitting before them. Over the past 6 months, they had been chasing a ghost, a man who had terrorized rural Hunan with a string of brutal murders, so horrific they had earned him the nickname, the Butcher of Hunan. His victims, women and young girls, had been found mutilated, their bodies discarded like trash in fields, rivers, and abandoned buildings. The province had been gripped by fear, with parents keeping their children close and curfews imposed in villages. But now the hunt had ended. Wang Chong was in custody, and the full extent of his crimes was about to unravel. To understand the depths of Wang Chong's depravity, we must first examine the roots of his life. A place where cruelty and neglect intertwined to shape the man who would come to be known as the Butcher of Hunan. Born into poverty and raised in an environment devoid of love or nurturing, Wang's story is one of pain, rejection, and a slow descent into darkness. Wang Chong was born on January 23, 1975, in a rural village in Hunan Province, China. It was a time of economic hardship for the region, with families barely scraping by on meager incomes from farming or manual labor. Wang's family was no exception. His father, Wang Shaoxing, worked long hours as a laborer in nearby fields, earning just enough to keep the family fed. His mother, Li Jing, stayed home to care for their growing brood of children, which eventually included 4 siblings. The house was cramped, a single-room mud-brick structure with no running water or electricity. From the moment he was born, Wang was enveloped in a world of scarcity. Food was often rationed, and meals consisted of little more than rice porridge and boiled vegetables. His father, frustrated by the unrelenting grind of poverty, was a harsh and volatile figure in the household. He ruled with an iron fist, and his temper was as unpredictable as the weather. There was no affection in that house, recalled a neighbor who lived nearby. You'd hear the children crying at night, and you'd know their father was beating them again. Wang, as the second of 4 children, received the brunt of his father's anger. His older brother, seen as the future breadwinner, was spared much of the violence, while Wang was singled out for his perceived weaknesses. His quiet demeanor, his slight frame, his inability to meet his father's impossible expectations. The beatings were brutal and frequent. Wang was often struck with whatever was at hand, a belt, a wooden stick, even the back of his father's hand. The physical scars faded over time, but the emotional wounds ran deep. By the age of 6, Wang had already learned to keep his head down, to avoid eye contact, and to retreat into himself whenever his father entered the room. The first significant turning point in Wang's life came when he was just 4 years old. One afternoon, while playing alone in the village square, he climbed onto a rusty old swing. As he pushed himself higher and higher, the swing suddenly snapped backward, throwing him to the ground. His head struck a large rock with a sickening thud, and he lay motionless for several minutes before a passerby found him and carried him home. Wang survived the fall, but the injury left a lasting mark. His skull had been fractured, and though his family could not afford medical treatment, the local healer bandaged his head and assured his parents he would recover. But the damage was done. Over the years, Wang began to exhibit signs of frontal lobe damage, a condition that neurologists later linked to his inability to regulate his emotions and impulses. The injury changed him, said Dr. Su Wen, a forensic psychologist who later studied Wang's case. The frontal lobe is responsible for decision-making, empathy, and impulse control. When it's damaged, a person can lose their ability to distinguish right from wrong. They become more prone to violence, less capable of understanding the consequences of their actions. After the accident, Wang's behavior began to shift. He became more withdrawn, his already quiet demeanor giving way to long periods of silence. His mother, busy caring for his siblings, dismissed his odd behavior as a phase, while his father saw it as yet another weakness to be punished. When Wang started school at the age of 7, he quickly became the target of bullying. His speech had been affected by the head injury, leaving him with a slight stutter that his classmates seized upon mercilessly. They called him names, mocked his halting words, and pushed him around in the schoolyard. One former classmate, Lu Yan, recalled Wang as a boy who seemed perpetually out of place. He didn't fit in with the rest of us. He never smiled, never laughed. Even when the teacher called on him, he'd just stare at the floor. We thought he was strange, so we didn't include him in anything. The isolation at school mirrored the isolation at home. Wang had no friends, no confidants, no one to turn to for comfort. He spent his days walking alone through the fields surrounding the village, often disappearing for hours at a time. His teachers, while noting his intelligence, grew increasingly concerned about his lack of social interaction. One teacher even wrote in his school file, "Wang Chong is a bright student, but his behavior is troubling. He does not engage with other children and seems to harbor a deep anger that he cannot express." That anger, though buried deep, would one day erupt in ways no one could have imagined. By the time Wang reached his teenage years, the cracks in his psyche had begun to widen. At 13, he got into a violent altercation with another boy who had teased him about his stutter. Wang attacked the boy with a ferocity that shocked onlookers, punching and kicking him long after he had fallen to the ground. It took 2 teachers to pull Wang away, and even then he struggled against them, his eyes wild with rage. It was like he snapped, one teacher later recalled. One moment he was quiet, and the next he was an animal. There was no reasoning with him. The incident earned Wang a week-long suspension, but it did little to curb his behavior. Over the next few years, he became increasingly aggressive, getting into frequent fights and lashing out at anyone who crossed him. His temper became the stuff of legend in the village, with children warned to stay away from him. At home, the violence escalated further. Wang, once cowed by his father's beatings, began to fight back. On one occasion, he struck his father with a wooden plank during an argument, leaving the older man with a broken nose. From that point on, his father's authority over him diminished, and Wang became untouchable within his own household. Wang's formal education came to an end at 16, when he was expelled from school for assaulting a teacher. The incident occurred after the teacher scolded him for arriving late to class. Enraged, Wang picked up a chair and hurled it across the room, narrowly missing the teacher's head. The expulsion was the final nail in the coffin of Wang's already troubled adolescence. With no education, no job prospects, and no support from his family, Wang drifted aimlessly through his late teens and early 20s. He took on a series of menial jobs, working as a farmhand, a construction laborer, a factory worker, but he never stayed in one place for long. His employers described him as sullen and unreliable, prone to disappearing without notice. But it was during this period of aimlessness that Wang began to nurture the dark fantasies that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. He would later tell investigators that his earliest thoughts of murder began when he was 19, after an argument with a co-worker left him feeling humiliated. "I wanted to hurt him," Wang said. "But not just hurt him, destroy him. I wanted to see the fear in his eyes, to know that I was the one in control." For years, those fantasies remained just that, fantasies. But as Wang grew older, the line between thought and action began to blur. By the time Wang committed his first murder in 1995, the seeds of his violence had already been planted. A childhood of abuse and neglect, combined with his head injury and social isolation, had created the perfect storm for his descent into depravity. "He was a time bomb," said Dr. Suwin. "All it took was the right trigger, and he exploded." And once Wang crossed that line, there was no turning back. What had started as a simmering anger had become a full-blown obsession, a hunger for power and control that would drive him to kill again and again. The first murder is often the hardest. The nerves, the hesitation, the fear of being caught. Many killers falter before taking that irrevocable step. But for Wang Chong, his first murder was not just a bridge crossed, it was an awakening. It would set the stage for a decade of bloodshed that would leave Hunan province terrorized and investigators scrambling to stop a predator who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a humid summer evening in June 1995, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and stagnant river water. In a small village on the outskirts of Zhengzhou, Lu Mei, a 23-year-old factory worker, was finishing her shift at a textile plant. Like many young women in the area, Lu lived a simple life. She worked long hours to support her family, walking the same dirt road home every night. The road was flanked by tall reeds on either side, their rustling barely audible over the distant hum of cicadas. It was a path Lu had taken countless times before, and despite the growing darkness, she felt no fear. But that night, she wasn't alone. Wang Chong had been watching her for days. He had seen her leave the factory, her slender frame illuminated by the flickering streetlights. He had followed her at a distance, memorizing her route, waiting for the right moment. As Lu rounded a bend in the path, Wang stepped out from the shadows. He had chosen his spot carefully, a place where the reeds grew thick, their towering stalks forming a natural curtain that hid them from view. "Excuse me," Wang called out, his voice low and steady. Lu froze, her eyes darting toward the figure emerging from the darkness. He was dressed plainly, his features partially obscured by the shadows. "Can you help me? I'm lost," he said, taking a step closer. Lu hesitated. Something about his tone unnerved her, but she didn't want to be rude. "This road goes to the village," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Just keep walking straight." But Wang didn't move. Instead, he took another step forward, his hands hidden behind his back. "You're very kind," he said. "Most people wouldn't stop to help a stranger." Before Lu could respond, Wang lunged. He moved with startling speed, his hands gripping a length of rope he had concealed in his jacket. Lu barely had time to scream before he was on her, the rough fibers of the rope tightening around her neck. She clawed at his hands, her nails digging into his skin, but Wang's grip was unrelenting. He pressed his knee into her back, forcing her to the ground as she thrashed beneath him. The struggle lasted less than a minute. When it was over, Lu lay motionless, her body limp and lifeless in the dirt. For a moment, Wang simply knelt there, staring down at the woman beneath him. His chest heaved with exertion, but his mind was eerily calm. The fear he had felt earlier, the fear of being caught, of making a mistake, had vanished. In its place was a strange sense of satisfaction, a quiet thrill that coursed through his veins like electricity. It was like a switch flipped, Wang would later recall. In that moment, I wasn't scared anymore. I wasn't weak. I was in control. Wang dragged Lu's body into the reeds, concealing her beneath a tangle of broken stalks. He rifled through her belongings, taking her wallet and a small silver necklace she had been wearing. Then, as the first hints of dawn began to creep over the horizon, he disappeared into the night. The murder of Lu may mark the beginning of Wang Chong's reign of terror. In the weeks that followed, he replayed the scene in his mind over and over, reliving the moment of power and control. But as the memory began to fade, so too did the satisfaction it brought him. He needed more. By the end of the year, Wang had killed 3 more women, each murder more calculated than the last. In October 1995, Zhang Li, a 19-year-old student, was found in a wooded area near her university. She had been strangled with her own scarf, her body posed in a grotesque imitation of sleep. Investigators noted the precision with which the killer had concealed her body, covering her with leaves and branches to delay discovery. In December 1995, Huang Min, a 27-year-old shopkeeper, was discovered in an abandoned warehouse. Her hands were bound with twine, and her face bore the unmistakable marks of blunt force trauma. A cigarette lighter was found near her body, an item investigators would later trace back to Wang. Each murder followed a similar pattern: a vulnerable woman, isolated and alone, attacked with ruthless efficiency. Wang's methods were meticulous, his attention to detail unnerving. He left no fingerprints, no witnesses, no evidence that could tie him to the crimes. For the families of Wang's victims, the murders were devastating. In the close-knit villages of Hunan, community ties ran deep, and the loss of even one life sent ripples of grief and fear through the region. "My daughter was everything to me," said Qinjing, the mother of Zhang Li. "She was the first in our family to go to university. She had such a bright future ahead of her. And then one day she was gone. Just like that. Who could do something so evil?" The police, overwhelmed by the growing number of cases, struggled to reassure the public. At community meetings, officers urged residents to avoid walking alone at night, to travel in groups whenever possible. But the warnings did little to ease the mounting panic. "We were living in fear," one villager recalled. "Every day, you'd hear about another woman who had gone missing, another body that had been found. It felt like no one was safe." For Wang, the murders were like a drug, each one temporarily satisfying his need for control, but never for long. He began to view his victims not as people, but as objects, tools to be used and discarded. "They weren't real to me," he later confessed. "They were just there. Something to take, something to destroy." But as his body count grew, so too did his confidence. Wang began to take greater risks, stalking his victims in more populated areas, lingering at crime scenes longer than before. He believed he was untouchable, a predator operating in a world of prey. And for nearly a decade, he was right. By the early 2000s, the murders had begun to follow a grim, recognizable pattern. The women of Hunan province were no longer walking alone at night. Fear had gripped the rural villages, and whispers of a serial killer were spreading like wildfire. For the local police, the mounting body count was becoming impossible to ignore, but the absence of leads made it feel like they were chasing a ghost. The killer struck silently and without warning, leaving behind only terror and mutilated bodies. There were no witnesses, no fingerprints, no DNA evidence. Each crime scene was a haunting tableau of violence and precision, as if the killer had rehearsed his actions to perfection. In 2003, the body of Chen Xiaoying, a 19-year-old university student, was found in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Zhengzhou. Her family had reported her missing 3 days earlier, and her death bore the now familiar hallmarks of the killer: strangulation, signs of sexual assault, and meticulous efforts to conceal the body. But this time, investigators found something they hadn't seen before: cigarette butts scattered near the scene. Forensic teams were deployed to collect the evidence, and the cigarette butts were sent to a newly upgraded lab in Zhengzhou for analysis. The results provided a glimmer of hope. Traces of saliva were present on the cigarette filters, and while DNA technology was still in its infancy in many parts of rural China, the lab had the capability to extract a partial genetic profile. Captain Zhao Wei, a rising star in the Hunan Provincial Police Force, was brought in to lead the investigation. Determined to catch the killer, Zhao assembled a task force of the region's best investigators and forensic specialists. The discovery of the cigarette butts marked the first concrete evidence they had, but it was only the beginning of a long and grueling hunt. "The moment we found those cigarette butts, we knew we had something," Zhao later said in an interview. "But the problem was, we didn't know who we were looking for. The DNA could only help us if we had someone to match it to." One of Zhao's first moves was to order a comprehensive review of unsolved murders in Hunan province over the past decade. The task force sifted through hundreds of case files, looking for patterns, similarities, and anything that might point to a single perpetrator. The patterns were chillingly clear. Each of the murders shared several key characteristics. Victim profile. The killer targeted women, primarily between the ages of 16 and 30, who were walking alone or in isolated areas. Many of the victims were students or low-income workers, suggesting that the killer preyed on those he perceived as vulnerable. Method of killing. The majority of the victims had been strangled, either with their own clothing or with a rope. Some showed signs of blunt force trauma, indicating that the killer used violence to subdue them before the murder. Crime scene staging. The killer took great care to conceal the bodies, often covering them with debris or dragging them to secluded locations. This suggested a methodical, calculated approach rather than impulsive violence. Geographic pattern. The murders were concentrated in rural areas around Zhengzhou, but were spread out enough to make it difficult to pinpoint a specific base of operations. The geographic spread indicated that the killer was mobile, possibly traveling by motorcycle or bike. The task force compiled a list of 23 unsolved murders that they believed were linked to the same killer. The realization sent shockwaves through the department. "We were dealing with one of the most prolific killers in Chinese history," Zhao said, "and he had been operating right under our noses for nearly a decade." The case that finally brought the police closer to their target was the murder of Li Na, a 25-year-old shopkeeper who disappeared in September 2005. Her body was discovered in a wooded area 3 days after her family reported her missing. Like the previous victims, she had been strangled and sexually assaulted. But this time, the killer made a critical mistake. Near the body, investigators found a cigarette lighter engraved with the initials WQ. The discovery was a turning point. Captain Zhao immediately ordered a search of local records, focusing on men with those initials who had a history of violence or criminal behavior. The search led them to Wang Chong, a 30-year-old drifter with a minor criminal record. Wang had been arrested several years earlier for theft, but had never been connected to any violent crimes. He lived alone in a small, dilapidated house on the outskirts of a nearby village, and his neighbors described him as a loner who rarely spoke to anyone. He was quiet, always watching, one neighbor recalled. There was something about him that just didn't feel right, but we never thought he could do this. Undercover officers were dispatched to monitor Wang's movements. For weeks, they tracked his daily routine, noting his unusual habits. He spent long hours wandering the countryside, often disappearing for days at a time. He avoided public transportation, opting instead to travel on foot or by bicycle. One officer, posing as a laborer, struck up a conversation with Wang at a local market. Wang was polite but distant, his answers short and guarded. But what stood out most was his eyes, cold, unfeeling, and devoid of any warmth. There was nothing there, the officer later said. It was like looking into the eyes of a statue. No emotion, no humanity. The task force began building their case, collecting evidence and interviewing people who had interacted with Wang. They discovered that he had worked at several factories over the years, often leaving abruptly without explanation. At one factory, a co-worker remembered seeing him staring intently at a female employee, his gaze lingering in a way that made her uncomfortable. "He gave me the creeps," the co-worker said. There was something about him, like he was studying her. On October 10th, 2005, police executed a raid on Wang's home. The operation was swift and precise, catching Wang off guard as he sat on his porch smoking a cigarette. He offered no resistance, his expression calm as officers placed him in handcuffs. Inside the house, investigators made a chilling discovery. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard was a collection of items that had belonged to his victims. Jewelry, necklaces, bracelets, and rings, many of which were later identified by the victims' families. Clothing, scarves, hair ties, and other personal items, meticulously folded and stored in a small wooden box. Photographs, a handful of faded photographs, some of which were of women who had never been reported missing. The evidence was overwhelming, and Wang Chong was taken into custody. But the true horror of his crimes would only come to light during his interrogation. The small, dimly lit interrogation room at the Zhengzhou police headquarters was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. The officers seated around the table exchanged uneasy glances as Wang Chong leaned back in his chair, utterly calm. His hands were cuffed tightly to the table, but his demeanor was relaxed, almost indifferent. There was no fear, no remorse, only an unnerving detachment, as though he were merely a spectator to his own crimes. Across from him sat Captain Zhao Wei, who had spent the last several months piecing together the trail of destruction this man had left behind. Zhao tapped a folder on the table, filled with crime scene photos, witness statements, and the forensic evidence that had finally led to Wang's capture. He leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. "We know what you've done, Wang," Zhao began, his eyes fixed on the man before him. "We've matched the DNA from the cigarette butts. We've found the lighter at the scene. We've spoken to your neighbors. There's no way out of this." For a moment, Wang said nothing. Then he let out a faint chuckle, his lips curling into a small, unsettling smile. "You don't need to convince me, Captain," he said, his voice low and measured. "I know why I'm here. You're right, I did it. I killed them. All of them." The room went silent as the weight of his words settled over the officers present. Zhao's hand tightened around the edge of the table. "All of them?" he repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. Wang nodded slowly. 45, he said, his tone almost casual. "Maybe more. I've lost count." As the interrogation continued, Wang began to recount his crimes in chilling detail. He started with his first victim, Lu Mei, whose murder in 1995 had marked the beginning of his decade-long killing spree. "She was so small," Wang said, his eyes unfocused as though he were reliving the moment. "I remember watching her walk down that dirt road, the way she kept looking over her shoulder. She knew something was wrong, but she didn't run. I liked that. I liked the fear." Captain Zhao's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, letting Wang continue. "When I grabbed her, she fought," Wang said, his voice taking on a strange, almost nostalgic tone. "She clawed at me, tried to scream, but the rope always works. It's quick, quiet, clean." One of the younger officers in the room turned pale, his hands trembling as he took notes. Zhao shot him a warning glance, but said nothing, unwilling to interrupt Wang's flow. "Afterward, I felt calm," Wang continued, "like all the noise in my head was gone. I sat there for a while, just looking at her. She looked peaceful, like she wasn't scared anymore." Zhao clenched his fists under the table, his mind racing with anger and disgust. But he knew he couldn't let his emotions show, not yet. "And the others?" he asked, his voice steady. "Did you feel the same after each one?" Wang tilted his head, as though considering the question. "Not all of them," he admitted. "Sometimes it wasn't enough. Sometimes I'd feel empty afterward, like I needed more. That's why I kept going. I was chasing that feeling, but it got harder to find." Over the course of several days, Wang detailed each of his murders with a level of precision that left the officers stunned. He spoke of how he selected his victims, often following them for days to learn their habits and routines. "I didn't pick them at random," he explained. "I watched them. I waited. I wanted to know their weaknesses. Some of them were too easy, though. I didn't like that. The ones who fought back, they were better." He described how he carried a length of rope and a small knife with him at all times, hidden in the lining of his jacket. He preferred strangulation, calling it intimate and efficient, but admitted to using his knife when necessary. "The knife was messy," he said, almost apologetically. "But sometimes you don't have a choice. They scream, they fight, you have to do what you have to do." The officers listened in grim silence as Wang recounted each murder, their emotions ranging from anger to horror to disbelief. For Captain Zhao, the hardest part was hearing how Wang spoke of his victims, not as people, but as objects, as pawns in a twisted game of power and control. "They weren't real to me," Wang said at one point, shrugging. "They were just there. Something to take. Something to destroy." As Wang's confessions continued, forensic psychologists began to build a profile of the man behind the murders. Dr. Su Wen, who was brought in to analyze Wang's behavior, described him as a classic example of a psychopath, a man devoid of empathy, driven by a need for power and control. "Wang Chong fits the profile of a predatory killer," Dr. Su said in a later interview. "He is methodical, calculating, and completely detached from the humanity of his victims. To him, they were not people, they were opportunities." When asked why he killed, Wang's answers were chillingly simple. "Because I could," he said. "Because no one could stop me. Because it felt good." Dr. Su also pointed to Wang's upbringing as a key factor in his development as a killer. The abuse he suffered as a child, combined with his head injury and social isolation, had created the perfect storm for violent tendencies to take root. He was a ticking time bomb, Dr. Su explained. His childhood stripped him of empathy, and his injury impaired his ability to control his impulses. Once he killed the first time, it became a way for him to assert control over a world that had always made him feel powerless. For Captain Zhao and his team, the confessions were both a breakthrough and a burden. They had spent years chasing this man, piecing together the fragments of his crimes, and now they were face to face with the monster they had been hunting. But hearing him speak so casually about the lives he had taken was almost too much to bear. "There were moments when I wanted to hit him," Zhao admitted in an interview years later. "I wanted to scream at him, make him feel even a fraction of the pain he caused. But I couldn't. I had to stay calm, stay professional. We needed his confession." One of the younger officers, who had been present for several of the interrogations, broke down in tears after hearing Wang describe the murder of a 16-year-old girl. "She was just a child," the officer said, his voice shaking. "And he talked about her like she was nothing, like she didn't matter." As Wang continued to confess, investigators worked tirelessly to corroborate his claims. They revisited old crime scenes, re-interviewed witnesses, and cross-referenced Wang's movements with the timeline of the murders. The items found in Wang's home, a collection of jewelry, clothing, and photographs, were matched to several of the victims, providing irrefutable evidence of his guilt. DNA from the cigarette butts found at the scene of Chen Xiuying's murder was a perfect match, as was the saliva recovered from bite marks on another victim. "We didn't just have his confession," Zhao said. "We had the physical evidence to back it up." There was no doubt, Wang Chong was the butcher of Hunan. The trial of Wang Chong had ended with a sentence as severe as his crimes demanded death. As the gavel struck, the butcher of Hunan was led out of the courtroom, his shackled feet dragging across the floor, the faint sound of metallic clinking echoing in the hushed chamber. For the families of his victims, the verdict brought some measure of closure, but the scars he had inflicted ran too deep to ever fully heal. For Wang, the sentence seemed to mean little. He did not flinch as the word death was spoken. He did not cry, beg, or show any sign of regret. The man who had terrorized a province for over a decade now faced his own end, and he appeared perfectly indifferent. Wang Chong was transferred to a high-security detention center in Zhengzhou, where he awaited his execution. Death row in China is a heavily regimented, isolated existence. Prisoners are stripped of any semblance of humanity, confined to small, bare cells with minimal contact with the outside world. The days are long, the nights longer. For most, the psychological weight of knowing their execution is inevitable breaks them down. But Wang was different. "He didn't seem to care," said Officer Lu Cheng, one of the guards assigned to monitor Wang during his time on death row. "Most prisoners cry, or they pray, or they try to bargain. But not him. He just sat there, staring at the wall, like he was already dead." Wang's cell was stark, just a narrow cot, a toilet, and a small barred window that let in a sliver of light. He spent most of his time sitting cross-legged on the floor, his expression blank. Meals were slid to him through a small slot in the door, and he ate in silence, chewing methodically, never leaving a crumb behind. He spoke only when spoken to, and even then his words were few. "He didn't ask for anything," Officer Liu recalled. "No books, no newspapers, no visits. It was like he didn't need anything, like he had already shut himself off from the world." Unlike many prisoners on death row, Wang received no letters, no visitors. His family, what little remained of it, had disowned him long before his arrest. His father had died years earlier, and his mother, now elderly and frail, refused to acknowledge him when reporters tracked her down after the trial. "He is not my son," she told them, her voice trembling with a mix of shame and anger. "The son I gave birth to died a long time ago. This person, this monster, I don't know who he is." Wang's siblings were similarly estranged, refusing to speak publicly about him. For all intents and purposes, Wang Chong was utterly alone, a fitting end for a man who had isolated himself from humanity long before his crimes began. As Wang sat in his cell, awaiting his execution, the families of his victims continued to grapple with their grief. Many expressed frustration that Wang had shown no remorse for his actions, no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. "We wanted to hear him say he was sorry," said Qinjing, the mother of Zhongli. "Even if it was a lie, we wanted to hear it. But he gave us nothing. Nothing. How can someone be so empty?" Some families wrote letters to Wang, hoping to elicit a response. They asked him why. Why had he chosen their daughters? Why had he taken so much from them? But Wang never replied. The letters piled up in the warden's office, unopened and unanswered. He didn't care about their pain, Captain Zhao Wei said when asked about Wang's silence. All he ever cared about was himself. Admitting guilt, apologizing, that would have made him vulnerable. And Wang Chong doesn't do vulnerable. 2 weeks before his execution date, Wang was visited one last time by Captain Zhao. The meeting was not officially sanctioned, but Zhao had spent years chasing Wang, and he felt he needed closure, if not for himself, then for the victims' families. Wang was brought into the small interrogation room, his shackles clinking as he shuffled forward. He sat across from Zhao, his expression as unreadable as ever. "You know why I'm here," Zhao began, his voice steady but lined with frustration. "I need to understand. All these years, all those women, why did you do it? What was it all for?" Wang stared at him for a long moment before finally speaking. "You wouldn't understand," he said, his voice flat. "It's not something you can explain. It just felt right." Zhao leaned forward, his jaw tight. They were human beings. They had families, lives. How can you sit there and act like they were nothing? For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed Wang's face, though it wasn't regret. It was irritation. "You keep asking me the same questions," he said. "You want me to give you some big answer, some reason that makes sense to you. But there isn't one. I did it because I wanted to. That's all." Zhao slammed his fist on the table, the sound echoing through the small room. "You're a coward," he said, his voice low and filled with anger. "You preyed on women who couldn't fight back because it made you feel powerful. But you're not powerful, Wang. You're pathetic." Wang smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Say whatever you want, Captain," he said. "It doesn't matter now, does it?" On the morning of March 15th, 2006, Wang Chong was led from his cell to the execution chamber. In China, executions are carried out swiftly, often by lethal injection or a single gunshot to the back of the head. Wang, like all condemned prisoners, was given a final meal, though he ate little. When asked if he had any last words, Wang simply shook his head. He refused to look at the warden, the guards, or the small group of witnesses, journalists and representatives of the victims' families, who had gathered to see justice served. One witness, Wang Wei, later described the moment Wang was executed. "I thought I'd feel relief or closure or something. But watching him, it just felt empty. He didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't say anything. He went out the same way he lived, cold and emotionless. The butcher of Hunan was dead. But for those he left behind, the wounds he inflicted would never fully heal." In the months following Wang's execution, Hunan province began to recover from the shadow he had cast over it. The families of his victims formed support groups, coming together to share their grief and honor the memories of their loved ones. "We can't bring them back," said Qinjing, "but we can make sure they're not forgotten. That's all we have left." Captain Zhao Wei, now retired, admitted that the case had left a permanent mark on him. "I've seen a lot of things in my career," he said, "but nothing like this. Wang Chong wasn't just a killer, he was a void. A black hole. And sometimes, when I think about him, I wonder if we'll ever truly understand what makes a person like that." Wang's story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary lives. For the people of Hunan, his name would forever be a symbol of fear, and of the resilience it took to stand against it. Story 4. The villagers of Aman Damai, a quiet hamlet on the outskirts of Medan in North Sumatra, Indonesia, were used to life moving at a slow, predictable pace. But on that humid night in April 1997, the jungle surrounding the village was alive with a different kind of energy, one of fear, confusion, and disbelief. A small group of police officers, armed with flashlights and grim expressions, trudged through the dense underbrush, their boots sinking into the damp earth. Behind them, a local farmer led the way, his hands trembling as he pointed toward the edge of a sugarcane field. "It's here," the man stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're buried here." The officers exchanged uneasy glances before stepping into the clearing. It didn't take long to find the first body. The shallow grave, marked by disturbed soil and a faint, sickly odor, gave way to the corpse of a woman, her arms bound, her body twisted unnaturally. As the officers worked through the night, more graves were unearthed. One by one, the bodies of young women, all in various stages of decomposition, were pulled from the earth. The count rose rapidly, 3, 6, 10, until it reached 42. The man responsible was already in custody, sitting silently in a dark, cramped interrogation room back at the Medan police station. His name was Ahmad Siraji, a 48-year-old cattle farmer and traditional healer known in the region as Dukuan, a shaman who claimed to possess mystical powers. To his neighbors, he was a quiet, unassuming man. To the women who sought his help, he was a healer and a guide. But to the police, he was something far more sinister, a predator, a manipulator, and a mass murderer whose crimes would send shockwaves through Indonesia. When officers had stormed Ahmed's modest home earlier that day, they found him sitting cross-legged on the floor, his head bowed in what seemed like prayer. He did not resist arrest, nor did he deny the accusations. Instead, he offered a chilling confession. "Yes," he said calmly, his voice devoid of emotion. "I killed them. I needed their saliva to strengthen my powers." The room fell silent. The officers stared at him, trying to comprehend the horror of what he had just admitted. Ahmed's face remained impassive, his dark eyes betraying no hint of remorse. He spoke as if he were discussing the weather, not the brutal murders of dozens of women. To understand the making of Ahmad Siraji, the man who would become one of Indonesia's most prolific serial killers, it is necessary to explore his origins. A life that began in poverty, isolation, and superstition, and ended in unimaginable brutality. Ahmad was born in 1949 in the small village of Say Semiang, near Medan, North Sumatra. The Indonesia of Ahmad's youth was a nation in flux, struggling to recover from colonial rule and grappling with political instability. For families like Ahmad's, life was defined by hardship. His parents were cattle herders, eking out a meager existence in the rural countryside, where food was scarce and superstition ran deep. From an early age, Ahmad's life was shaped by two forces, poverty and mysticism. His father, Haji Kamsur, was known in the village as a deeply superstitious man. Though he worked as a herder, he also dabbled in traditional healing practices and rituals, often performing dukuan ceremonies for the villagers. These ceremonies, steeped in local folklore, were meant to ward off evil spirits, cure illnesses, or bring blessings. To the people of Say Semiang, the line between the spiritual and the physical was blurred, and men like Haji Kamsur were both respected and feared. Ahmad's father was not a kind man. He was known to be strict, authoritarian, and quick to anger, often taking out his frustrations on his children. Ahmad, the third of 10 siblings, was a frequent target of his father's wrath. Beatings were a regular occurrence in the household, and Haji Kamsur often justified his harsh punishments as a way to toughen his children or correct their moral failings. For Ahmad, the constant abuse instilled a sense of inferiority and helplessness that would haunt him into adulthood. "My father was a hard man," Ahmad later said during an interview after his arrest. "He taught me how to work hard, but he also taught me fear. Fear of him, fear of failure, and fear of being weak." While Ahmad feared his father's temper, he was also fascinated by the rituals his father performed. From a young age, he would sit quietly in the corner of their small hut, watching as his father chanted incantations, burned offerings, and called upon unseen forces. Ahmad saw the way villagers respected his father, the way they brought gifts of food and money in exchange for his blessings. It planted a seed in Ahmad's mind. Power lay in the spiritual, in the ability to control the invisible forces that governed people's lives. But the world of spirits and mysticism was not always benevolent. The villagers believed that the jungle surrounding Say Semiang was home to dark entities, malevolent spirits who could bring sickness, bad luck, or even death. Stories of hauntings and curses were whispered around campfires, and children were warned never to stray too far from the village. These tales terrified Ahmad, but they also intrigued him. He began to wonder if the power his father wielded could also be used to confront or even control these dark forces. As Ahmad grew older, he began to imitate his father's rituals, practicing in secret when no one was watching. Using bits of string, leaves, and ash, he performed his own crude ceremonies, trying to summon the power he believed his father possessed. But these experiments were met with failure, leaving Ahmad frustrated and resentful. He wanted more knowledge, more power, and more respect. When Ahmad was just a teenager, his father died suddenly, leaving the family in a precarious position. The loss of their patriarch not only plunged them deeper into poverty, but also left Ahmad without a role model. Though his relationship with his father had been fraught, Ahmad idolized the man's authority and mystical prowess. With his father gone, Ahmad felt unmoored, his sense of identity fractured. The death also marked a turning point in Ahmad's spiritual journey. He became obsessed with the idea of legacy, believing that it was his duty to take up his father's mantle as a spiritual leader. But unlike his father, who had been content to perform small rituals for the villagers, Ahmad hungered for something greater. He wanted to be more than a healer. He wanted to be powerful, feared, and revered. "My father's death left a void," Ahmad would later say. "I wanted to fill it, but I didn't know how. I had to find my own way." In the years that followed, Ahmad immersed himself in the study of mysticism. He sought out old texts, consulted with other shamans, and practiced rituals with increasing intensity. But his ambition was not purely spiritual. Ahmad also craved material wealth and social status. He saw mysticism not just as a path to power, but but as a means to escape the grinding poverty that had defined his life. The cultural landscape of North Sumatra played a significant role in shaping Ahmed's beliefs and practices. The region was a melting pot of traditions, blending animism, Islam, and local folklore. While Islam was the dominant religion, many villagers still adhered to pre-Islamic beliefs, particularly when it came to matters of the supernatural. Shamans, or dukuan, were an integral part of this cultural fabric, serving as intermediaries between the physical and spiritual worlds. Ahmed's rise as a dukuan coincided with a period of social and economic upheaval in Indonesia. For many villagers, life was a constant struggle, and the promises of a shaman, whether for wealth, health, or love, were a source of hope. Ahmad quickly realized that his position as a dukuan gave him access to vulnerable individuals, particularly women, who were desperate for solutions to their problems. "People trusted me," Ahmad said during his confession. "They believed I had the power to help them, and I used that trust." By the time Ahmad reached his late 20s, he had established himself as a respected dukuan in the region. Villagers came to him with their troubles, and he performed rituals with an air of confidence that belied his inner turmoil. But beneath the surface, Ahmad was becoming increasingly consumed by his desire for power. The rituals he performed began to take on a darker tone, and he started to experiment with practices that bordered on the taboo. His transformation into a killer was not sudden but gradual, a descent into darkness fueled by a combination of superstition, ambition, and deep-seated psychological scars. Ahmad later claimed that it was a dream that ultimately set him on his murderous path, a revelation he believed was delivered by his deceased father. In the dream, his father's spirit told him that to achieve ultimate power, he must kill 70 women and collect their saliva as part of a ritual. "At first, I was afraid," Ahmad said of the dream, "but then I realized it was a sign. It was my destiny." This dream, whether real or imagined, became the justification for Ahmad's crimes. He believed that by following his father's instructions, he could harness the spiritual energy of his victims and become invincible. It was a delusion born of desperation and a warped sense of purpose, but to Ahmad, it was the ultimate truth. As Ahmad embarked on his deadly mission, he maintained the outward appearance of a humble shaman, hiding his true nature from those around him. But within the sugarcane fields that surrounded his village, a nightmare was unfolding, one that would claim the lives of 42 women before it was finally brought to an end. By the late 1980s, Ahmad Siraji had fully embraced his role as a revered shaman, or dukuan, in the rural outskirts of Medan, North Sumatra. To most villagers, he was an enigmatic figure, a man who claimed to commune with spirits and offer solutions to life's most pressing problems. Women, in particular, sought his services. They came to him for blessings, love spells, fertility rituals, and cures for ailments. But what they didn't know was that Ahmad had begun his descent into darkness, guided by the twisted belief that killing them would grant him supernatural power. The first murder was not premeditated, or so Ahmad later claimed. He described it as an experiment, a first step into the unknown. In 1986, a young woman from a neighboring village approached Ahmad for help. Her name was Wadi, and she was desperate. Her husband had left her for another woman, and she believed she had been cursed. She wanted Ahmad to perform a ritual that would bring her husband back to her. Ahmad listened intently, nodding as she spoke, his mind already working. "She trusted me completely," Ahmad later said in his confession. "She believed I could fix her life, and I used that trust." Ahmad instructed Wadi to meet him after dark in a secluded sugarcane field near his home. He told her that the spirits were strongest at night and that the ritual required absolute privacy. Wadi, eager to have her life restored, agreed without hesitation. When the time came, Ahmad brought Wadi to the clearing and began the ritual. He chanted incantations, sprinkling her with water and herbs, all the while building her trust. Then he told her to lie down on the ground, explaining that this would allow the spirits to enter her body and cleanse her of the curse. Wadi complied. It was then that Ahmad struck. Using a piece of cord he had hidden in his pocket, he strangled her. Wadi struggled, her hands clawing at the dirt, but Ahmad held firm until her body went limp. In the eerie silence that followed, Ahmad tilted her head back and collected her saliva in a small vial, believing it held the essence of her soul. "I was terrified," Ahmad later admitted, "but I also felt powerful. It was like I had taken something from her, something that made me stronger." Afterward, Ahmad buried Wadi's body in a shallow grave, carefully arranging her head to face his house. This, he believed, would allow her spirit to transfer her energy to him. The next day, Ahmad went about his life as if nothing had happened. The villagers noticed nothing unusual, and Wadi's disappearance was chalked up to her troubled personal life. But for Ahmad, the experience had opened a door he could never close. After the first murder, Ahmad became more methodical. He refined his technique, experimenting with different rituals to see what would produce the most spiritual energy. Over the next few months, he killed 2 more women, both of whom had come to him seeking help. Each time, he followed the same pattern, gaining their trust, luring them to the sugarcane field, and strangling them. He collected their saliva and buried their bodies, always ensuring their heads faced his home. I believed I was following the spirit's instructions, Ahmad said. Each woman brought me closer to my goal. By the time he had killed his 3rd victim, Ahmad had developed a chilling sense of detachment. He no longer hesitated or felt fear. The murders became routine, a ritual he performed with cold precision. Ahmad's victims spanned a wide range of ages and backgrounds, but they all shared one thing in common: vulnerability. Many were poor, uneducated women who believed in the power of the supernatural to solve their problems. Some came to Ahmad seeking love spells, others wanted to improve their luck or cure an illness. To Ahmad, their reasons didn't matter. They were simply means to an end. By the early 1990s, Ahmad had killed at least 20 women. The sugarcane fields near his home had become a graveyard, the bodies buried in neat rows like macabre offerings to the spirits he claimed to serve. The villagers, unaware of the horrors unfolding in their midst, continued to view Ahmad as a respected shaman. His reputation only grew, as he used his victims' disappearances to enhance his mystique. When women disappeared, people thought it was the spirits taking them, Ahmad later explained. They thought it was part of the ritual. They never suspected me. As Ahmad's confidence grew, so did his ambition. He began targeting women from villages farther away, believing this would reduce the risk of suspicion. He also started experimenting with the rituals, adding new elements to appease the spirits. In one instance, he instructed a victim to bring gold jewelry as an offering. After killing her, he kept the jewelry, using it to fund his modest but comfortable lifestyle. Ahmad's wife, Tumanai, and his 3 other wives, who lived with him under the same roof, claimed to know nothing of his crimes. However, some investigators later speculated that Tumanai may have been complicit, at least to some extent. She helped Ahmad manage his clients and was present during some of the rituals, though she denied witnessing the murders. "I thought he was helping people," Tumanai said during her police interrogation. "I didn't know he was killing them." Whether Tumanai was truly ignorant or simply turned a blind eye remains a matter of debate. What is certain is that Ahmad's crimes escalated in both frequency and brutality. Despite his outward calm, Ahmad began to feel the psychological strain of his actions. He claimed to be haunted by the spirits of his victims, who appeared to him in dreams and whispered to him in the dead of night. But rather than feeling guilt, Ahmad interpreted these visions as proof that his rituals were working. "The spirits spoke to me," he said. "They told me I was on the right path. They reminded me of my father's instructions." Ahmad's belief in his own righteousness allowed him to continue killing without remorse. To him, the women were not people. They were sacrifices, tools to be used in his quest for power. By the mid-1990s, Ahmad's body count had risen to over 40, though the exact number remains uncertain. His crimes might have continued indefinitely if not for his growing arrogance. Believing himself untouchable, he became less cautious, targeting women who were more likely to be missed. In 1997, Ahmad made a crucial mistake. He murdered Sri Kemala Dewey, a 21-year-old woman whose family was fiercely protective. When Sri failed to return home, her family launched a search, eventually tracing her steps back to Ahmad. For the first time, the cracks in Ahmad's facade began to show. The villagers, who had long revered Ahmad, were shocked when the police stormed his home and arrested him. But the true horror was yet to be revealed. The disappearance of Sri Kemala Dewey was the first thread that unraveled Ahmad Siraji's web of terror. Unlike many of his earlier victims, SRI's family was persistent. Her husband, Tawfiq, was not willing to accept the vague explanations offered by the villagers, that she had run away, eloped, or fallen victim to the dangers of the jungle. He knew she had gone to see Ahmad, the revered shaman, for a ritual, and he was determined to find out what had happened to her. She left the house saying she was going to see him. Tawfiq told the police when he reported her missing. She trusted him, but she never came back. At first, the local police were skeptical. Cases of missing persons, especially women, were not uncommon in rural North Sumatra. Poverty, domestic disputes, and superstition often led people to disappear without a trace. But Taufik's insistence, combined with rumors circulating in the village about Ahmed's growing wealth and strange behavior, prompted the police to act. On a sweltering afternoon in April 1997, a team of police officers arrived at Ahmad Siraji's modest home. The small, weathered house, surrounded by sugarcane fields, appeared unassuming, even ordinary. But the officers couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister lay beneath its surface. Ahmad was calm when the police arrived. He greeted them with a polite smile, his demeanor unbothered. When asked about Sri Kemala Dewey, he denied having seen her recently. "I don't know anything about her," he said, his voice steady. "People come to me for help, but I can't keep track of everyone." But the officers were not convinced. As they searched the house and the surrounding property, they discovered something that sent chills down their spines. Women's clothing and jewelry, tucked away in a hidden compartment. These items were later identified by the families of several missing women. "It was like opening Pandora's box," one officer later said. "We knew immediately that something terrible had happened here." Ahmad was taken into custody for further questioning. Meanwhile, the police began to comb the sugarcane fields that stretched behind his home, a sprawling, secluded area that Ahmad had always insisted was sacred ground. The search of the sugarcane fields began at dawn the next day. Armed with shovels and guided by villagers who had noticed disturbed patches of soil, the officers began digging. It didn't take long to uncover the first body. The grave was shallow, hastily covered with loose dirt and leaves. The body inside was that of a young woman, her arms bound and her head tilted unnaturally. As the officers continued to dig, more bodies were unearthed, each one arranged with its head facing Ahmed's house. "It was like the field was a cemetery," said Lieutenant Satanto, who led the investigation. "But not a sacred one, a cursed one. The smell of death was everywhere." By the end of the day, the police had unearthed several bodies, all in various stages of decomposition. The villagers, who had gathered to watch the search, were horrified. Many of them had known the women, who were now being pulled from the ground. "We thought they had run away," said one villager. "We never imagined they were here, buried so close to us." Back at the Medan police station, Ahmad sat in a dimly lit interrogation room. His hands were cuffed to the table, but his expression remained calm, even serene. He didn't deny the accusations. In fact, when confronted with the evidence, he offered a chilling confession. "Yes," he said, his voice steady. "I killed them. All of them. It was for the spirits." The lead investigator, Inspector Hariono, leaned forward, his face a mixture of disbelief and disgust. "Why?" he asked. "Why would you do this?" Ahmed's answer was as bizarre as it was horrifying. He claimed that his deceased father had appeared to him in a dream, instructing him to kill 70 women and drink their saliva. This, he said, would grant him supernatural powers and ensure his success as a shaman. "The spirits needed their energy," Ahmad explained. "Their saliva was the key. It was the essence of their souls." Inspector Hariono pressed further. "How did you choose your victims?" "They came to me," Ahmad replied with a faint smile. "They trusted me. They wanted my help. I didn't choose them, they chose me." Ahmad went on to describe his method in detail, speaking with a chilling detachment. He would lure the women to the sugarcane field under the pretense of performing a ritual. Once there, he would instruct them to lie down on the ground and close their eyes. He would chant incantations, sprinkling them with water and herbs to cleanse their spirits. Then, without warning, he would strangle them with a cord. "It was quick," he said. "They didn't suffer for long. Afterward, I collected their saliva and buried them. I always made sure their heads faced my house. That's what the spirits required." The officers listening to his confession were stunned. Ahmad spoke as if he were describing a mundane task, not the brutal murders of dozens of women. He didn't show any remorse, Inspector Hariono later said. To him, it was like he was talking about slaughtering animals, not human beings. As the investigation continued, the true scale of Ahmed's crimes became horrifyingly clear. Over the course of 11 years, he had murdered 42 women, though he insisted that he had planned to kill 70, as instructed by his dream. The victims ranged in age from teenagers to middle-aged women, all of whom had come to him seeking help. The discovery of the mass graves made headlines across Indonesia, and the once quiet village of Aman Damai became the epicenter of a national scandal. Reporters flocked to the area, interviewing villagers and documenting the horrific discoveries. "We couldn't believe it," said one villager. He was one of us. We trusted him. How could he do this? During the investigation, police also questioned Ahmed's 4 wives, who lived with him in the same house. While 3 of the wives claimed ignorance of his crimes, his senior wife, Tumanai, admitted that she had been aware of the killings. I knew what he was doing, she said during her interrogation. But I couldn't stop him. He said it was for the spirits, that it was his duty as a Dukuan. I was afraid to go against him. Tumanai's admission shocked the investigators. While there was no evidence that she had participated in the murders, her knowledge of the crimes and her failure to report them made her an accomplice in the eyes of the law. By the time the investigation concluded, the sugarcane fields around Ahmed's home had yielded 42 bodies, though authorities suspected that there could be more victims who were never found. The sheer scale of Ahmed's crimes made him one of the most prolific serial killers in Indonesia's history. Ahmed's calm demeanor, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, baffled investigators. When asked if he regretted his actions, he simply shook his head. I did what I had to do, he said. It was my destiny. By the time Ahmad Siraji was brought to trial in 1998, his name had become infamous across Indonesia. Known as the Dukuan Pembunuh, the shaman killer, he was accused of murdering 42 women over the course of 11 years. The scale of his crimes, combined with his chilling lack of remorse, had shocked the nation. People from every corner of the country followed the case closely, horrified by the details that emerged during the investigation. The trial, held at the Lubuk Pakam District Court, became a spectacle. Journalists, families of the victims, and curious onlookers packed the courtroom, eager to witness the proceedings. The weight of so many lives lost hung heavy in the air, and all eyes were on the man accused of committing the atrocities. On the first day of the trial, Ahmad Siraji entered the courtroom wearing a modest white shirt and sarong, his hands shackled. He walked with a calm, almost detached demeanor, as though the gravity of the situation did not concern him. The families of the victims, seated in the gallery, murmured angrily as he passed. He didn't even look at us, said Siti Rama, the sister of one of the victims. He just stared straight ahead, like we didn't exist. The prosecutor, Rockmad Haryanto, wasted no time laying out the case. Standing before the packed courtroom, he delivered a scathing opening statement. This man, he said, pointing to Ahmad, is not a healer. He is not a shaman. He is a predator who used his position of trust to lure innocent women to their deaths. He killed not for survival, not out of desperation, but because he believed it would make him powerful. The prosecutor then outlined the evidence against Ahmad: the women's clothing and jewelry found in his home, the mass graves discovered in the sugarcane fields, and Ahmad's own chilling confession. As Haryanto spoke, the courtroom fell silent, the enormity of Ahmad's crimes sinking in. When it was Ahmad's turn to address the court, he did not attempt to deny the charges. Instead, he repeated the same story he had told the police, that he had been acting on instructions from his deceased father, delivered to him in a dream. I am not a bad person, Ahmad said, his voice calm and emotionless. I was doing what the spirits required of me. The women came to me for help, and I helped them transcend. Their deaths were not meaningless, they were part of a greater purpose. The gallery erupted in outrage at his words. Families of the victims shouted at Ahmad, calling him a monster, a liar, a demon. One man, the father of a 17-year-old victim, stood up and yelled, "You took my daughter's life for your own greed. You deserve to die 1,000 deaths." The judge, Sri Alas, banged her gavel to restore order. She turned to Ahmad and asked him directly, "Do you feel any remorse for what you have done? Do you regret taking the lives of 42 women, mothers, daughters, sisters?" Ahmad paused for a moment before answering. "No," he said simply. "I did what I had to do. Regret is for those who fail. I did not fail." His words sent a chill through the courtroom. Over the course of the trial, the prosecution presented a parade of witnesses and evidence that painted a horrifying picture of Ahmad's crimes. Relatives of the victims testified about how their loved ones had disappeared after visiting Ahmad, desperate for his help. Forensic experts described the condition of the bodies found in the sugarcane fields, detailing the signs of strangulation and the meticulous way in which they had been buried. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was Ahmad's ritual notebook, found during the search of his home. The notebook contained the names of several of his victims, along with detailed notes about the rituals he had performed. In one chilling entry, Ahmad had written, "Saliva collected, energy absorbed, spirit satisfied." The notebook also revealed Ahmad's ultimate goal, to kill 70 women, as instructed by his dream. The fact that he had stopped at 42 was not due to any moral awakening, but simply because he had been caught. If we hadn't found him, said Prosecutor Rockmad Haryanto, he would have continued killing. He was unstoppable. Ahmed's defense attorney, Rahmat Saya, had an impossible task. The evidence against his client was overwhelming, and Ahmed's own confession left little room for doubt. Still, Rahmat attempted to argue that Ahmad was not of sound mind, that his belief in spirits and mysticism had clouded his judgment. My client is a product of his environment, Rahmat said. He grew up in a culture steeped in superstition and fear of the supernatural. He truly believed that what he was doing was necessary, that it was ordained by the spirits. This does not excuse his actions, but it helps us understand them. The argument did little to sway the court. The families of the victims were outraged, viewing it as an attempt to minimize Ahmed's responsibility. He knew what he was doing, said Nuraini, the mother of one victim. He planned it, he carried it out, and he did it again and again. That's not madness, that's evil. After weeks of testimony, the trial reached its conclusion. On April 27, 1998, the court delivered its verdict. The judge, addressing Ahmad directly, spoke with a tone of finality. Ahmad Siraji, she said, you have committed crimes of unimaginable cruelty. You preyed on the trust of vulnerable women, using their faith in you to satisfy your twisted desires. You killed without mercy, and you have shown no remorse for your actions. This court finds you guilty of all charges. The judge then handed down the sentence, death by firing squad. The courtroom erupted in applause and tears. For the families of the victims, the verdict was a moment of justice, though it could never undo the pain they had endured. It won't bring my sister back, said Sidi Rama, but at least he can't hurt anyone else. Ahmad, however, remained calm as the sentence was read. He showed no emotion, no fear. When asked if he had any final words, he simply said, I accept my fate. It is the will of the spirits. The case of Ahmad Siraji left a lasting impact on Indonesia. It sparked widespread discussions about the dangers of blind faith in mysticism and the exploitation of vulnerable individuals. Many called for greater regulation of shamans and traditional healers, though such practices remained deeply ingrained in the culture. For the families of the victims, the scars of Ahmed's crimes would never fully heal. Memorials were erected in the sugarcane fields where their loved ones had been buried, and their names were etched into the collective memory of the nation. As for Ahmad, he spent his final days in prison, awaiting execution. He never recanted his confession, nor did he express any regret. On July 10, 2008, 10 years after his conviction, Ahmad Siraji was executed by firing squad. His death marked the end of one of the darkest chapters in Indonesia's history.